We are live. All right, we're back. We're back after a week's break. We are back with the Oracle of London, back from the Peak District, Alexander Mercouris, and we are joined by the one, the only, Mr. Gonzalo Lira. How are you gentlemen doing today?
I am extremely well. I'm delighted to be back. I'm really happy to be on this program with Gonzalo again. Can I say I had a glorious holiday in the Peak, and I feel fit and recharged and rested and ready to go and really to get into the teeth of this extraordinary times that we're in and all the kinds of things that are happening. Lots of things going on all at the same time, by the way.
Yeah, it's once again it's a delight to be here with you two gentlemen. Chat, how's it going? I hope you guys are doing well. And yes, it feels like we are sliding into, it's getting serious, let's put it that way, because a lot of stuff is popping up that the mainstream media, which has been so relentless in trying to hide it for so long, is finally starting to reveal the truth of what's going on. And people are in shock, to put it mildly.
All right, so let's just do a quick, let's just say a quick hello to everybody that is joining us on Odyssey. How is everyone doing on Odyssey? How is the chat on Odyssey? Is it okay? Let me know in the chat if Odyssey is running all right. Hello to everyone on Rumble. Hope everyone's doing well on Rumble, and to everyone on YT. Thank you for joining us on YT. Hello to our moderators on YouTube, GEC 812. Wow, notification came up soon as the show started. Thank you, GEC, for that. And also, Lady Cosmica is also moderating. How are you doing, Lady Cosmica? Let me just see if there's anyone else that is moderating. Gonzalo Lira, you have a blue wrench. You're also moderating.
Yeah. It's just, it makes me feel important.
Thank you, Gonzalo, for moderating as well. And I'm sure more moderators will jump in as the live progresses. And of course, hello to our awesome locals community. How is everyone doing in the locals chat? Good to see everyone back on the locals chat. Okay, all good here on Odyssey. Great. Okay, because I'm not seeing the Odyssey feed, so that's good. Let's get started. Gonzalo, Alexander, you guys were in the middle of saying we're hitting a tipping point. Things are heating up. What could possibly be going on in the world?
Yeah, I just want to mention something totally that is something that we don't usually cover when we talk, and I know that neither your channel nor mine really covers it, but cryptocurrency seems to be going down the tubes. The two major decentralized finance outfits have sort of like they're collapsing, in the process of collapsing, and Bitcoin itself is hitting lows from years ago. The whole cryptocurrency thing seems to be falling, and I think none of us three can really seriously discuss the cryptocurrency issue, and I'm not here to bring it up. But what I do want to say is that it's indicative of an overall loss of faith.
Yeah,
it seems that all of a sudden people are sort of like waking up and like saying, wait, things are really crappy. Things are really crappy. And why didn't anybody tell us? And that's the sense I'm getting. Alexander, what do you think?
No, I'm not going to discuss cryptocurrencies because I've never understood them, and I've never discussed them precisely for that reason. There are people who do understand them who are much better advanced to discuss them. About the loss of faith, the sense of panic that's now in the air, about that, I completely agree. And of course, when I talk about panic works at many different levels. There's the panic amongst governments. There's the panic that we're now going to see in Kiev. And Gonzalo, you're going to talk a lot about that because you're in Ukraine. You can talk about the feelings, the mood there, where I get the sense it's shifted dramatically over the last couple of days, maybe week or so. But there's other levels of panic as well. If you are, a family, not perhaps on, with the best means, and you're suddenly seeing your bills rising faster than inflation, and you've got debts to pay, and you've got a mortgage to pay, and you've got housing, energy costs and fuel costs, and you need to move around in your car, and you're finding that where you could comfortably afford all these things a few weeks ago, now you can't, then you are going to start panicking too. And that's now having a cascade effect, it seems to me, right across the whole system. And it's having an effect in the United States, where for some incomprehensible reason, known only to economists, political commentators, and Democrats, people apparently were expecting inflation to start falling at around this time. And they've suddenly awoken to the fact that, on the contrary, it's actually rising, even according to their own deeply suspect and, I suspect, corrupted figures. We have panic in the Eurozone, where Christine Lagarde has been forced now to start moving towards a position of raising interest rates, which is going to be calamitous for Southern Europe and Italy, and indeed for the entire viability of the whole Eurozone. We see panic in Japan, where they're now printing money at Weimar levels. I mean, they really are. I mean, you know, the levels of QE there are completely out of control. And of course, we have electoral problems starting to build. We did a program yesterday, Alex and I, about the situation in France, where Macron's party did much less well than he had expected. And bear in mind, the French system is such as one would expect a centrist party, to do well, because the whole structure of politics in France works in its favor. But we see a political crisis in Britain with a lame duck leader who's also extremely dangerous, in my opinion. And of course, we have problems now accelerating all around all sorts of places. Now, as you know, of the European countries, the two I know best, well, I used to know France very well. I've lost contact with people in France. But the two I know best, obviously, is Greece, of which Alex is a much better authority than I am. But I also know Germany. And I get the sense of a major darkening now of the mood there too. I mean, we've now had this extraordinary news that the German government is bailing out Gazprom Germania to the tune of 10 billion I can't remember, dollars, euros, or whatever it was, vast sums of money being thrown at what is still technically a Russian-owned Gazprom subsidiary, but one which was seized by the German government in that, smash and grab raid that they did, which is absolutely shocking and profoundly illegal, quite frankly. And the legal rationalizations for it that you read in places like the Financial Times, they just don't even stand up to any kind of legal scrutiny at all. Anyway, now they find that they can't operate it. They can't run it themselves because Gazprom were the people who knew how to run it. This is their business. This is their industry. The German government doesn't understand that at all. So they're throwing money at it. They've been throwing money buying gas as frantically as they can. And of course, Germany is now heading for recession. And of course, inflation is taking off in Germany too. And if you know anything at all about the structure of the German economy, you would know what havoc elevated levels of inflation can do to the structure of the German economy. A country like the United States can keep running on 8, 9, 10% inflation for a while. It's demoralizing, it's difficult, it hurts investment, but it can keep chundering along, at least for a time. In Germany, the whole system is based like a Swiss watch. If you start getting inflation into the system, it's like throwing sand at a Swiss watch. It gradually grinds up, stops the whole machinery working. So there is a darkening of the mood right across the board. We have a crisis in the Gulf, where the JCPOA seems on the brink of collapse, and Israel is talking about launching strikes on Iran. And of course, we've had a disastrous summit meeting between China and the United States in Singapore, which has, of course, confirmed the Chinese darker suspicions of what the United States is up to, and therefore has increased the risks of a war in the Pacific. So we have all of these things going on at the same time. And at the head of it, at the center of it all, we have an empty suit in the Oval Office. He has signs, whatever is put in front of him. He's now in an even worse position, because you get the sense that his advisors are now all arguing with each other. So you're getting contradictory orders. He's talking about more sanctions against Russia, and at the same time, he's urging the agro-industrial complex in the United States to buy more Russian fertilizer. I mean, he's doing all of this thing at the same time.
Well, let's start with the U.S., because the U.S. is kind of like collapsing right before our eyes. I mean, really disintegrating. Because first of all, you have the issue of the inflation. The inflation numbers that came out were, I do believe it was 8.8% per year. But that, of course, or 8.9. It's slipped my mind right now, but it was 8 point something. I think it was 8. And so the point is that, see, these numbers have been massaged since back in 1995. That the inflation numbers that we see are not really reputable. For anybody in chat who's interested, I suggest you go and check out a website called Shadow Stats. Neither the two Alexes nor myself have any kind of relationship. We're just, passing along this recommendation because all three of us follow it. Shadow Stats is giving the best true numbers of the American economy, because John Williams, who runs it, is using the old metric to measure inflation, the old basket of goods and services that was done before the 95 revamp, which was done for political reasons, basically to limit the adjustments of Social Security to save money on Social Security. Okay. That being said, the inflation is going through the roof. Jerome Powell is now, the odds are something like 90% in the betting pools that Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, is going to have to raise rates by 0.75%. I don't think that's going to be enough, not by a long shot. And I think that he can't. What happens in this kind of situation where you have incipient inflation is that you, as a central bank, many times think, well, I'll just raise interest rates like a catch-up kind of game. And so inflation rises, you raise your rates. Inflation rises some more, you raise your rates some more. You have to get ahead of it, right? Really ahead of it, like Paul Volcker did in 1980. Paul Volcker, in the face of the oil shock of January of 79, he raised the Fed fund rate. At one point, he shot it up to 20%, which is, almost absurd. But that killed inflation dead in its tracks. And that's what you have to do. Inflation is not something that you can incrementally raise your rates to check. But the current Federal Reserve Board does not feel that it has the political maneuvering room to do what has to be done. And part of the reason is that the administration, the Biden administration, is not fully behind the Fed because there are so many factions, as you said. There are these different factions behind the scenes puppeteering Joe Biden. We have the Obama faction. We have the Clintonista neocon faction. We have the progressive faction. We have the Biden family faction. And all of these people have different priorities, different desires. And so, like you point out correctly, there's the Clintonista neocon faction that wants to double down on sanctions against Russia. Whereas the Obama faction has realized, holy cow, we've shot ourselves in the foot. We need Russia. Europe needs Russia. Everybody needs Russia. And to cut out the Russians actually helps the Russians. The Russians, for those of you who don't know, over the last, since the start of this war, they've pocketed something like, what was the figure? It was astronomical, like 7 billion in just straight up profits, and they've grown their what you call it, their oil output. I mean, it's all coming up roses for the Russians. At the same time, the best thing that ever happened to the Russians. That's the funny thing, and the most catastrophic thing that ever happened to the Europeans. Of course, for the Russians, it's great because what has happened. I'm skipping around a little bit. Let me just do this little point about Russia and get back to the States, because I think that we should discuss the United States situation in some detail. The Russians, what Putin has wanted to do for the longest time is to, cut out more and more the oligarchs. And that's what his mission has been since he started as president back in 99. He's been trying to edge out the oligarchs because he wants the Russian state, not oligarchs, to have control of Russia's future. And so he's succeeded up to a point. He's always had to negotiate, but gently edging them out little by little, very patiently. Because of the sanctions, all of these oligarchs got chopped off at the knees. And because of this too, the intellectual classes, the upper middle classes in Russia have all of a sudden realized, hey, this truly is an existential war between NATO, US, and Russia. This is us or them. And so all of a sudden, it's been a huge wake-up call for the upper classes. I'm not talking about the elite classes. I'm talking the top quintile, the top 2 quintiles of Russian society. They understand all of a sudden, you know, the Europeans hate us, actively hate us, all the Russophobia and all the rest of it. And so we're going to have to, you know, go on our own and turn to the East. And so because of the sanctions, of course, the Russians are not buying any goods and services from Europe. And so they are saving an enormous amount of money to the point that it's becoming a problem for the Russian central bank. Whereas in the United States, to pivot on the central bank issue, the US central bank understands that if it raises rates too high, it'll break so many debtors in the American economy. The bond market would crater, would collapse, because there would be too many people who would become instantly insolvent. And so the central bank in the United States cannot afford to raise rates enough to halt inflation, even as it watches its currency, the dollar, deteriorating day by day, and everybody's feeling it. Everybody in American society sees it in the price of food, the price of gasoline, the price of heating, electricity. And so in the central bank, there's a sense of panic and of trying to catch up with inflation. And insofar as the White House is concerned, they're rudderless, and they have all these internal skirmishes between the progressives, the Clintonista neocons, and the Obama faction. Nobody knows where America is going. And so we have this complete and utter disaster. And now the progressive Clintonista faction, the progressive faction plus the Clintonista faction, is pushing gun control legislation that is unbelievably divisive. And on top of that, Joe Biden is saying outright that he considers half the population an enemy of the government. And so we are heading in a very, very bad direction insofar as the United States. Sorry for going on, but I just wanted to cover these points that I think are very important to analyze at this time.
Thanks, Gonzalo. I just wanted to follow up on some of your points. You talked about Paul Volcker. I remember that. I remember that huge interest rate rise to 20%. Yeah. One other central bank raised interest rates over the last few months. To 20%.
The Russians.
The Russians. And Elvira Nabiullina did that, of course, at the end of February, after the sanctions against the Russian central bank were announced. And, of course, it was done as an emergency measure, basically to get ahead of inflation.
Yeah.
And
she did it.
Succeeded. Yes. Now, she's been cutting interest rates. Interest rates now are at roughly the level they were before the war. And she cut them again by 150 base points on Friday. And she gave a speech on Friday explaining her decision. And it is in some ways the most extraordinary speech by a central banker I have ever read in my life. And the reason it's extraordinary is because you find Nabiullina astonished by her own success. I mean, it's quite remarkable. She's saying, you know, inflation is now going into reverse. We're seeing prices fall, even as demand is starting to pick up again. Economic activity is picking up. You know, the numbers are so good. I can't quite bring myself to believe them. They're just too good to be true.
What's going
that's
on?
What Nabiullina is saying. Now, you know, I mean,
the sanctions were the best thing that ever happened to Russia.
Absolutely. Sorry. And you know, this is a situation where Nabiullina has obviously psychologically prepared herself for a crisis and crisis management. And what she has discovered is that, yes, there's going to be lots of problems. There's still supply chain issues that need to be resolved. There's, you know, some, you know, people are going to take a hit. But that great crisis that she expected hasn't happened. And that's the best position a central bank can possibly find itself in. Now, I just wanted to read to use some comments from Splash, which is one of those websites that are published by the shipping industry. Alex and I obviously come from the countries, Greece, Cyprus, which is very dominant in the world of shipping industries, in the shipping industry, and the Greek ship owners are a major force. So there's a bigger forum that they have every year at Posidonia 2022. And these are some of the comments which Greek ship owners have been making. The Russians are earning at least double what they were earning pre-war. I don't know what kind of penalty that is.
Oh,
Another,
man.
it's nice to have an announcement that our fleet should not carry oil, Russian oil. But I think this is bullshit. As simple as that. The sanctions are not clear cut. There are only a lot of gray areas. This only creates problems. Problems, obviously,
Well,
for the Russians.
Alexander,
everyone.
correct me if Alexander, correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't some business leader just now saying, enough of these sanctions, we should roll them back? I mean, Wolfgang Munchau, Munchau, I want to say Munchau,
yeah, absolutely,
yeah. Of Eurointelligence, who's a very, very smart economist, and he used to be, I think, the chief economist of Citibank or something.
Yeah,
I mean, he's a smart man, and he was basically saying, we should have thought this through a little bit more, basically, which I found an absurd statement from somebody who's supposed to be an adult in the room. And by the way, another adult in the room. Alexander, did you hear this imbecile Sikorsky saying that NATO should consider giving nuclear weapons to Ukraine?
I mean, another sign of desperation. I did, but shall we just focus on the economics?
Sure.
Because
Alexander, could you just read the line after the quotes? You missed, I think, one very important sentence there, which says that the EU was upset with these comments. Can you read that last line? Right after the third comment.
Right after the third comment.
Article.
Some of these remarks were not amenable, prompting a reaction from the EU. In other words, the EU was angry that some of these comments were being made.
Because they got a dose of reality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's the attitude
that to me sums everything
children.
up. Sorry, that sums everything up.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I don't like it, so shut it down. What the hell?
What the hell, yeah. I mean, they'll be very, very angry with Wolfgang Munchau, but I mean, he speaks, I'm sure, for an awful lot of people in Germany. And you're absolutely correct when he says, we didn't think this through. Well, as I was saying to Alex when we read that, we actually discussed it briefly on in one of our videos. We're just three guys with laptops who, think and look at things and work things out. It's not difficult. It wasn't difficult to work it out.
Yeah.
No,
Gonzalo, Alexander,
in March, we knew this was going to happen. In February, we knew it was going to happen.
Yeah, Alex,
guys, yesterday, Stoltenberg, when he was in Sweden, he said, NATO, we didn't expect Turkey to react like this. We had no idea.
I mean, nobody knows that Erdogan is a difficult character, and that he has issues with Kurds. I mean, this isn't something that occurs to us.
Are you telling that Erdogan is a difficult character? No, you're lying. No. You're making it up.
What a disaster this is. What a disaster for Finland, for Sweden. Yeah. You're telling me that NATO, who's also Brussels-based, all these institutions are in Brussels, they employ how many people? 50,000 people? They have how many think tanks and NGOs all around them, all over the world? You're telling me there was not one analyst in all of this NATO architecture who said, Mr. Stoltenberg, before we fast track Finland and Sweden, maybe we may want to think about how other members feel about this. And maybe Turkey may have. I'm studying Turkey. Maybe they have some issues with this. Not one person. They have no plan. This is my point. Yeah, they have no plan. Alex, they're making all of this up as they go along.
Yeah,
Alex, let me point
out.
Russia
has a plan.
Russia has a plan. You're absolutely right.
And they've been planning this since 2014. Sorry, that's all I want to say. That's my point. Russia's been planning this since 2014. The collective West is clueless.
No, it's worse than that, because what happens is, I mean, you're absolutely right. But your point, you're saying, Alex, correctly. They have 50,000 people. Why didn't anybody stand up? It's the culture of conformity and fear. Because the educational establishments in the West, Europe and the United States, it prioritizes conformity. It prioritizes having the best and the brightest, and these people are smart. Don't think otherwise. They act stupidly many times, but they are intelligent in the raw IQ sense. But since they are incentivized to never deviate, to never question authority, when some stupid proposal is put on the table, none of them have the courage to say, this is foolish, this is stupid, it's going to have these obvious effects. The three of us, like Alexander, you said, we're just three guys with laptops, big deal. And we figured this out in February when all these sanctions talk, we said, you're going to cut off your own energy supply, Europe. This is what the Arabs did in 1973 and nearly broke the Western economies, and you're doing it to yourselves. We knew this in February, but the culture of conformity among the leadership class leads to this kind of groupthink, group decision that's a disaster. And they're waking up to it, I think. Are they? You tell me.
Well, some people are. Now, can I just say, going back to Alex's point, that, you know, none of them think things through. We've now had the most extraordinary article by the former head of the British Army. And, you know, you've got to understand the British Army, the uniformed military in Britain is not the same as the political leadership of the Ministry of Defence. And he makes exactly that point. He made exactly the same point that Alex made. He says the West, and this is, I'm reading the headlines, the West is not thinking strategically about the Ukraine war. And the government is leading a let's see how it goes strategy. And then he goes on to say, grand strategy is the stuff of great power. It is the generation, organization, and application of means in pursuit of strategic goals. There was a time when the conduct of grand strategy was second nature for Britain's elite, that it did not even have a name. And now he says that we have this relationship between strategy and tactics and achieving goals has become hopelessly broken, undermining the all-important mechanism of application through ends, ways, and means. And he goes on and discusses this, and he says it's not just Britain, it's the entire West. They just don't think things through. That's essentially what he's saying in rather complicated language. But they don't have a plan. They just do not have a plan. They're making it up as they go along. Now, I'm going to say this. I think at the outset, they had a plan, or they had what they thought was a plan. They thought they would be able to instigate a war in Ukraine. They expected the war would, go on for a couple of weeks, months, whatever. They expected that the Russians would take losses and get bogged down. And in the meantime, all these sanctions would knock over the Russian economy, which they assumed was a house of cards, that it would collapse, the banking system would collapse, inflation would explode to hyperinflation levels, and Putin would fall. And that wasn't a plan because it wasn't based on any real thinking and on any proper analysis of the data. What they acted on was a set of assumptions and prejudices. And of course, they've now discovered that things are not turning out at all the way they expected, that the Russians are not bogged down in Ukraine. They're fighting a war of attrition there against, which is a disaster for us, for the West. The West is totally ill-equipped to fight a war of attrition, even via proxies. And at the same time, they're fighting, we find ourselves locked in an economic war. And it turns out that it's not the Russian economy that is the house of cards. In fact, as we saw from Navalny's comments, it's turned out to be stronger, more stable, more resilient than even some members of the Russian government themselves imagined. It's turned out that the flaws, the weaknesses are in our economic structure, which is also unable or unfit to endure a prolonged economic war of attrition, which is what we also find ourselves in.
Yeah,
To say, saying the last, by the way, is not to deny that there were major problems in the Western economies which were building up already. But of course, we didn't see that either.
Well, it seems to me that a lot of the economic problems that have been going on and accumulating in the West are finally coming to a head. And it was paradoxically this whole sanctioning of Russia and the realization or revelation, call it what you will, that the West needed Russia far more than Russia needs the West, because Russia's humming along. I watch YouTube videos of people living in Russia, and things are fine. Food's on the shelves. Everything is hunky-dory. They even reopened McDonald's under a different name, but it's the same food. It's the same garbage that I love. But besides the point, the thing is, it was a weird projection on the part of the leadership class. They projected onto Russia the flaws of the West, the problems, the chronic problems of the West. And here comes the issue. These chronic problems of the West, for instance, the cultural divides, the economic over-indebtedness, the political polarization and loss of direction on a political level. All of these issues are coming to a head very quickly. And I think that the economic issues are, of course, the thing that everybody notices. Gasoline prices over $5 and galloping up to $10 soon enough. I already said that I expect American gasoline to be $10 a gallon by the end of the year. And in the UK, I know that petrol, as they call it there, is over... It's over £2 per liter, I believe. Isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I was driving to the Peak District. I should know.
Yeah. And so the thing is, the economic is leading all of these problems. The economic is going to be the crisis point, and we are far from. I mean, the possibility of another sort of financial crisis that affects the banking institutions. It's not so much the banking institutions, but the bond markets. That's the thing that really scares me, because all of these corporations are so over leveraged. They're so geared up because they had such cheap capital for so long that they're not going to be able to service their debts because of inflation. The bond market might be the one that really tanks, and that is going to be a very, sticky, whatever you want to call it. Choose your metaphor. But the point I'm saying is that the economic cratering of the West is the bleeding edge of this systemic crisis, which I think is not merely economic. It's political, but it's also cultural and social. It is a deep divide in a broken block that is the Biden administration, in a weird way, is this metonym for the divisions within the West. From the outside, it seems that there is, it's all unity and there's one guy on top, Biden. But when you start looking in, you realize that there are all these factions that are fighting each other to the death because it's all collapsing. And I think that this is something that we should be paying attention to. And I think that over the next 6 to 18 months, we're going to see serious breaks in our society. Do you guys agree or not?
Absolutely. Gonzalo, can I just follow up on a few points that you made?
Sure.
Again, and I want to just briefly touch on what you were saying earlier about the Russian middle classes. And there's two people who I think I read, Russians, who I think are fairly representative of what you might call not middle class, because they're obviously richer than that, but at a higher economic level, but they're not oligarchs. They're not the kind of people who associate with oligarchs. They are, if you like, westernized elite Russians.
Anatoly Lieven, I read his article.
Is that one? So you're talking about Dmitry Trenin, and the other one is Edward Lozansky.
Yeah,
Edward Lozansky, who used to travel and come to the United States, whom I actually know personally. I met him several times. I like him, and who used to know Ronald Reagan, by the way, and was a huge admirer of Ronald Reagan.
Really?
Anyway,
that's cool.
These people have now come round to the view that the West loathes Russia so much that it's trying to use the Ukrainian crisis to, as they put it, solve the Russian problem, i.e. destroy Russia.
Yeah.
And that is a very representative view now in Russia about what is happening. So it's not just Dmitry Trenin, who is interesting indeed, because of course he was the former head of the Carnegie Endowment in Moscow. I mean, he was paid
He's
by
westernized.
American,
Yeah.
very, very deeply westernized. But he's somebody who nonetheless is Russian and identifies strongly with Russia. And as I said, he was profoundly shocked by the way in which the West has acted over the last couple of months. And you can see the scales, if you could put it like that, have absolutely fallen from his eyes. So that's absolutely right. And then, of course, I did read Anatol Lieben's article. Anatol Lieben, by the way, in my opinion, was outstanding on the diplomacy. He has been terrible about the war. He has completely not followed it or understood it. And I'm afraid, I have to say, I think his commentary about the war has been so bad that I'm afraid it's to some extent damaged my formerly high opinion of him.
Yeah,
I just mentioned that in parenthesis. But
Yeah,
anyway, that's putting that aside. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is about recessions and the West, and the fact that interest rates might trigger economic problems and recessions and things of this kind. I'm going to offer my own view, which is one of the fundamental reasons why the West is in the mess that it's in, is that since the late 1980s, since Greenspan became chairman of the Fed, there has been a concerted attempt in the West to abolish recessions. Recessions are somehow seen as something utterly disastrous that must be avoided at all costs. And of course, politicians hate recessions because they are difficult for them politically. So that's been at the bottom of a lot of the problems, because as a result, whenever things point to recessions, the inclination always has been to loosen monetary policy. And the longer you go on doing that and trying to avoid recessions, the more problems build up in the economy, the more indebtedness grows, the more structural deformities in the economy start to build. Because, and this is absolutely essential, and it was very clearly understood by the classical economists of the 19th and early 20th century, recessions are essential in a properly functioning market economy. I mean, Schumpeter talked about creative destruction. You have to have recessions every so often to cleanse out the system. Now, that doesn't mean when you get recessions that you let everybody go to the wall, that you don't provide some kind of safety net for people. That's a different thing. But to try to do away with the business cycle has been a disaster. And we have been doing that in the West for far too long, and it's made problems far worse. Now, the other thing that's happened is that one of the reasons we were able to do that is that starting in the 1990s, we managed to find in the West that we could keep things going at a sort of trundling rate. Economic inequalities grew, productive businesses declined, but overall things seem to be trundling along quite nicely. We were getting 2% growth every year. We could rely on that. In fact, it's now clear to me, it's become very clear to me that this is very heavily dependent on two things. One, which I've always known about, was that the East Asians, primarily the Chinese, were providing us with lots of cheap consumer goods. And that was reducing heavily, inflationary pressures within Western economies. It was bad because it ultimately undermined our industrial base, but it did mean that you could print lots of money, create lots of money, and you didn't have to worry about inflation. Now, there was something else, and I've heard lots of Russians tell me this, but I never took it very seriously, because I have to admit this, I hadn't appreciated its importance, but we've now seen it. But a lot of Russians are saying the other thing that is underpinning Western growth is the sudden accessibility since the end of the Cold War of natural resources from Russia. Oil, coal, metals, things like foodstuffs
Yep.
increasingly over the last couple of years. And they were providing downward pressure on natural
Yeah.
resources, on commodities.
Yeah.
So we had a situation where we had cheap consumer goods coming in from the East, cheap natural resources coming in from the former Soviet bloc, and we were able to fool ourselves into thinking that the inflation problem had gone away forever. And the result is, since our entire obsession was to avoid recessions, we were able to print money, and we didn't think that there would be any inflationary consequences in doing so. Well, the
Yeah.
result is that we now have an accumulation of problems, all of which have come together at the same time. We have supply chain problems with the East Asians, which we're going to make much worse if we fall into a war with China over Taiwan.
Which is
We
going to
have
happen.
we have a natural resources crisis because we recklessly sanctioned Russia without understanding its importance in terms of commodities. And of course, if we now get ourselves involved in a war in the Gulf, we're only going to make that worse. And of course, at the same time, the printing machine, the money printing machine, has been allowed to go on for far too long, creating all kinds of massive structural weaknesses in the Western economies, which you are absolutely right when you said that we can't raise interest rates far enough and fast enough to get on in front of the inflation problem, which is now building. So we have landed ourselves in the worst of all worlds, because after the end of the Cold War, all the really clever people, the really strong-minded people, the people who understood how economies worked, they've all somehow passed away, gone from the scene, and we are left with people like Robert Habeck and Jake Sullivan and people like that.
Well, it seems to me you're absolutely right in everything that you have said insofar as the deflationary pressures that occurred because of access to Russian raw materials and the deflationary pressures because of the arbitrage of Asian labor that helped the Western consumers live an extraordinarily rich life, of course, at the cost of hollowing out completely their own manufacturing base. The West has nothing to manufacture, nothing to build. The only thing that was building anything was, the German automotive industry, and that would be pretty much it. And pills, the pharmaceutical companies. But the thing that that you're absolutely right, and I think is crucial, is to note that no recession was allowed to exist, was allowed to happen, especially after the '91 recession, which cost George Herbert Walker Bush his reelection. By rights, he should have been reelected in the '92 election, but the '91-'92 recession killed his chances. And after that, every president refused to preside over a recessionary environment. And the thing is, for people in chat who might not quite understand why a recession is so important, you have to think of it like in a forest, you need periodic wildfires, or else the dead brush accumulates so much that it'll burn the entire forest. You have to think of it in those terms, because what happens in any economy that's burgeoning, that's growing, is that you have a lot of malinvestment. You have a lot of capital allocated to businesses that are simply not profitable, not particularly good. And a recession burns out all of those essentially bankrupt firms, because a recession, a downturn in the economy, in the famous phrase by Warren Buffett, it shows who's swimming without a bathing suit, right? I think that was the saying, or who's swimming naked, when the tide rolls out. And it's very important, because that way the inefficient businesses go bankrupt. You need those bankruptcies to clean out the dead wood, to connect with the metaphor of the forest, right? But if you don't let that happen, you start to have malinvestment. And to the chat, notice how many companies have these bullshit jobs, chief diversity officer, equity consultant, all of these nonsense occupations. Or notice these managerial positions that really don't seem to do anything, like team leader for whatever, A lot of these make work jobs are created in an environment where you have a lot of cheap capital, and so you can afford to gear up with all kinds of nonsense jobs that make companies inefficient. You need those recessions to burn that out, burn off that fat. But the American economy has grown obese because of the lack of recessions. And now we're going to hit the crash. I mean, I'm mixing my metaphors in the end of this terribly, but I think you get the picture. And I think, Alexander, you're absolutely right. And I think that it's something that people, we are noticing it. Academia will notice it in 5 years, long after this is all over.
I will just qualify by saying this, that I think you characterized many of the problems of the US economy extremely well. It is in rude health compared to Europe, believe me. I mean, Europe is, it is chaos. That nothing is making any sense anymore. And we've taken every conceivable misdecision that we could possibly have done over the last 30 years. Our energy policy is an absolute mess. Our food policy is an absolute mess. The banking system in some parts of Europe barely functions at all. Even if you accept that it's all rickety in the US, it just doesn't even compare to how bad the banking system in parts of Europe is. And of course, we've now embarked on this economic war, which is, utterly devastating for us. So I think that the US is in very poor shape, certainly compared to how it once used to be. The American economy of my youth was a tremendous force, but the European economy is in dreadful shape. And absolutely right when you say, German industry. There's lots of good companies in Germany, or at least there were, because until the coming of the euro, Germany actually ran a proper fiscal and monetary policy. The Bundesbank and the German finance ministry knew their job, and they did it very well. And they understood how Germany needed to operate. And there was the economics ministry that also did its job, and the various regional governments, the Länder, very close connections with German businesses. And I don't want to idealize the picture. It wasn't. It was never perfect. But overall, if you went to Germany then, you would have been very impressed by how many good companies there were. And of course, now all of that is in jeopardy. And you're absolutely right that, the Mittelstand companies, that great base of family-run German businesses, they're finding it more and more difficult to keep investing. They've been under stress for a long, long time. And increasingly, investment has trickled into the car industry, which has become dangerously over-dominant within the German economy. If the German car industry collapses, the effect on Germany is just as it has. If it does, it's difficult to imagine a Germany without it now. If Daimler fails, and it's been quite close to failing in the past, but so it's not inconceivable that it might. But if Daimler, for example, fails, goodness knows.
I want to, if you don't mind, I wanted to focus. I know we're all exhausted by the Ukraine situation. I'm more than most because I'm here. It's all I think about. But I just want to pivot a little.
We should do. We need to, because it's still, in my opinion, the epicenter of the crisis.
It is at this time.
The world crisis. What has brought about this inflection point is Ukraine. So over to you, Gonzalo.
Well, no, I just want to point out something. The war in the Donbass is just grinding along. Just grinding along, and the Russians every day they're eating up a little bit more of it. And, there's Severodonetsk, there's this and that. It doesn't really matter the names. What you have to understand is that there is not one day where the Ukrainian forces are capturing territory and holding it definitively. And every day, the Russians are capturing territory and holding it definitively. And so that's all you need to understand. This is just a matter of time at this point. I've been reading some stuff about how the Russian army they keep saying, the Western analysts keep saying that the Russians are running out of ammunition, running out of tires, running out of food, running out of air. I mean, it's all kinds of running out of stuff, right? The Russians, it turns out that sometimes they are rotating soldiers by the day, which is incredible as far as I'm concerned. That is, a soldier fights for one day and they pull him out and replace him with another unit. So you have these Russian soldiers that are constantly being rotated, especially the high combat, high intensity areas. They are not allowing their men to spend many days in active, stressful combat. And whereas, of course, the Ukrainian soldiers, which it just breaks my heart, these poor men, how psychically, spiritually annihilating it must be for them to be there day after day after day and no possibility of relief. And so, of course, it's inevitable that the Russians are going to win everything. That's why whenever you see videos of the Russian soldiers, they look fresh because they are fresh. Okay. And so there's that issue. What is clear is that the Russians are going to win. It's just a matter of time. And slowly it seems that the Biden administration has been making these nods about the issue of like, well, Zelensky, maybe you should negotiate and consider giving up territory. And try to bring a ceasefire, because it seems like the West is realizing that this is going to end badly. And they're trying to end this. This is my impression at this time. But before I hand it over to you, I just want to emphasize something that I find just so despicable and disturbing that has happened, which has been the indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas in the city of Donetsk, which has been happening, and it's becoming more and more apparent. I've been hearing this for a couple of weeks now, but it's intensified. They are shelling every day and deliberately targeting civilian establishments, maternity wards. You know how the Ukrainians said, oh, the Russians shelled a maternity ward, which had been abandoned several weeks before combat ensued because the Russians had positioned their men right there. But no, the armed forces of Ukraine, and this is the truth, and I'm saying it perfectly well aware that I'm in Ukraine, and it's actually kind of dangerous for me to say this, but the armed forces of Ukraine are deliberately shelling civilian areas, including hospitals and maternity wards in the city of Donetsk, without any kind of military rationale. It is strictly punitive. It is strictly for revenge against civilians. This is happening now. This is a grotesque violation of human rights. This is a crime, a war crime. And nobody in the West is saying a word. I see video after video showing the buildings and the places in Donetsk where this is happening now. And you have on the ground people saying, yes, it's June 12th. I am here. And here is a shell from the French, the French howitzers that they sent. And here it is lying in front of my feet. And here I am in the middle of Donetsk. There's video, photographic evidence. And in the West, they are completely silent of this, which I find so despicable. So despicable. And I am a third-party observer in this conflict. And so I can only imagine the hatred and rage that this creates among ethnic Russians, both in Ukraine and in Russia, how they must hate the fact that the West is so hypocritical and not pointing out this despicable behavior. Sorry for ranting, but it just has to be said. Somebody has to say it.
Yeah, I mean, can I just clarify Gonzalo's point? Yesterday, Donetsk, which is the capital city of the Donetsk People's Republic, it's a city that rebelled against Kiev, the Maidan regime, the Maidan government, back in 2014. Yesterday, it was subjected to the heaviest shelling that it has experienced at any point since the crisis in Ukraine began in 2014. I mean, it was a shelling from all kinds of directions from the Ukrainian artillery. This is the same artillery that is running out of ammunition, and this is fairly confirmed. They are instead of using what artillery they have to fight the Russian military, they have been firing it, launching it indiscriminately at Donetsk. Now, I
Civilians.
have seen the film.
Civilians.
Exactly. I've seen the film of this. I've seen the pictures. I have absolutely no doubt at all that this is true. I mean, because I say that because sometimes, one side accuses the other of all sorts of bad things. On this occasion, the evidence that this happened is, clear cut, and it is overwhelming. And you would never know about it if you were in Britain and you got all your news from the British media. They have not mentioned the fact that this heavy shelling of Donetsk has took place. They've never mentioned the fact that Donetsk or any of these places has ever been shelled. And of course, what the British media is just one case in point. I'm sure the American media is the same, the German, the French, even the Italian. The Italian media at one point, Corriere della Sera, one of the leading Italian newspapers, actually at one point showed the debris and the destruction caused by a Ukrainian missile attack on Donetsk, and claimed, entitled the picture as the results of a Russian missile attack on the Ukrainian city. But I mean, it's really disturbing that there is clearly a policy of suppressing the fact that this kind of indiscriminate shelling is taking place. Now, all of this is happening at a time when the military situation of the Ukrainian military in Donbass is deteriorating fast, and we're going to hear more about this. Again, Gonzalo is closer to the situation, but from everything I'm hearing about is that Ukraine is running out of ammunition. It's basically run out of armored vehicles, which means that when they're not in their trenches or their bunkers or in their buildings, and Ukrainian troops are caught in the open by this enormous Russian artillery shelling, then of course they are desperately vulnerable. And that is causing massive losses. Ukraine is now starting to admit the losses that it is suffering. It's now revised upwards its totals to 200 dead a day, which is,
it's still less than half the actual number.
But it's starting to creep up to. In terms of total casualties, wounded as well as dead, it's well over 1,000 people a day. And also, information we're getting is that the Russians have now crossed the Seversky Donets River, which just a day before the British Ministry of Defense was saying was going to be critical to the outcome of the war, that they've crossed it in multiple places, and that they're advancing on all the major remaining Ukrainian concentrations. Now, I'm going to say something else. The other thing that I have been told, and I'm not a military person, is that within every military formation, there are the cadres, the people who really matter, and without whom a military formation cannot function. The officers, the non-commissioned officers, the unit leaders, those sort of people. They are the real trained manpower. And it seems that Ukraine has been losing these at a staggering rate, and they cannot be replaced. You might mobilize, you might conscript thousands of people, but you can't train enough people fast enough to replace your losses. And of course, this is creating problems. So whilst the Russians are fighting with what is essentially an expeditionary force drawn from a peacetime army, which is fully professional and which is being rotated in the way that Gonzalo says, Ukraine is straining to fight with what it has, and it's throwing more and more untrained manpower into the battle.
Oh, also women
losing.
Also women.
Well.
Did you hear that they are
Gonzalo, you'll elaborate on these things because I hadn't heard about that. So that's the kind of information you're able to give us. But but the point is they are running through their cadres, the necessary people who are essential to keep all of their military machine operating effectively. So again, Gonzalo, you clearly have more information about this. So tell us a bit more about the fact that they're conscripting women as well. Is this for infantry?
Yeah, it's not clear to what purpose, but yeah, the word has gone out that they are starting to conscript women. And now you have to understand that these conscription drives, they have, so far they've done 6, I believe. I could be mistaken, but at least 6. And what has happened, I've seen pictures of this, of military police going to different homes, apartments, looking for people who have been called up. The word is that in the last conscription drive of calling up reservists, less than 10% showed up, and all the other men are just gone. Okay. Now this is unconfirmed rumor, just talk, but this kind of thing seeps out pretty easily. And it makes complete sense. Do keep in mind, when this conflict started, I mentioned to you guys that I knew people personally who business associates who had, in a panic, fled Kiev, and they were hiding out in the country because they knew that they were going to be called up and forced to join the army and take a rifle and go and shoot somebody. And they're middle-aged businessmen with families and all that. They have no training for this kind of thing. And so they ran off. It's clear that this is happening on a countrywide level. That's why the call up for women, which is crazy. Okay, that just shows that we're coming to the end of the Ukrainian army as a viable force. Now, what is also clear, and by the way, I would suggest to everybody to follow the Military Summary channel, which is providing the best day-to-day analysis of the combat. This is something that that Military Analysis channel has highlighted, and I, on my own sources, have also confirmed. There is a huge fight between Zelensky and his circle and Zaluzny, who is the head of the armed forces. I mean, he's the actual general in charge. Zaluzny is a 50-year-old man, career officer. He seems very capable. And they are fighting, these two factions in Kiev are fighting over tactics of the battle. The Zelensky regime wants a stand and fight approach, and Zaluzny wants, pull back, shorten the front, have more effective defense, that sort of thing, more maneuver warfare. But the fact that the leadership is having these fights and they're having to compromise in order to continue this war, this is a disaster, because it indicates that, an army has to have one leader. You can't have, divisions in the leadership. That's why the military is organized as it is. It's organized as a dictatorship for a very good reason. When you have conflicting orders or compromised orders, you don't achieve the best military results. And this seems to be happening as the Russians continue their relentless advance. Now, my thinking at this time, and from what is, and do keep in mind, I am a very interested observer, of course, because I'm right here, and I have family members who live in different areas of the country that are affected by this war. But my sense here is, if and when the Donbass region, the Donbass front collapses, as it seems very close to doing. Okay, I can't tell you when, but it's sort of like, I don't know when it's going to rain, but I know it's going to rain, the kind of thing. I don't know exactly when the collapse will happen, but it will happen. And once that happens, it's very possible that the entire Ukrainian armed forces will simply collapse. There's also something else to mention, and this is confirmed by multiple sources. It seems clear that the State Security Service, the SBU, is being used to round up any potential deserter and being used to arrest anyone who is unhappy with the situation or who complains about it on social media. We've seen multiple videos of units complaining about leadership, equipment, this, that, the other, and then shortly thereafter, a video of that same unit being arrested. We've seen this multiple times. There are multiple accounts of people, soldiers in the Donbass battle who want to surrender, and they are being arrested by the SBU. And there are a couple of unconfirmed reports. I just have to say this and emphasize this. These are unconfirmed reports at this time that some of these people are being shot. Now, this is not how a winning army operates. Insubordination has always happened in every army, even in winning armies. Insubordination, desertion. This is par for the course, because in armies, if you're talking about 200,000 men going into war, it's inevitable that you're going to have discontented people for whatever reason, who will desert, who will be insubordinate, whatever. But if you have these random reports popping up everywhere like fungi all over the place, and they are drifting up, percolating up to civilians such as myself, then you know that this is a very, very serious problem that is probably affecting the entire army. And so this is the situation of the Ukrainian armed forces. It's collapsing because it is clearly on the losing side, and nobody who's close to the front has any illusions as to the outcome of this. The only question becomes politically how this ends, but it is going to end.
Can I just say the question of desertion has been mentioned, desertion, that the Ukrainian armed military now has a problem with desertion, has actually seeped through to the British media. And it was in fact referenced by an intelligence report from a Western intelligence agency, which was mentioned and discussed in the British media. Now, I should say that we were never told which intelligence agency provided this report. It wasn't the British. That's the only thing I can say with some confidence. But it did say that the enormous amount of losses that the Ukrainian military is suffering is causing morale to fall, and that is now becoming one of its consequences of this collapse in morale is a major increase in the level of desertion. Gonzalo, there's two things I wanted to ask briefly. Have you any idea why Zelensky and his political leaders around him are so determined to stand and fight in places which on the face of it look completely undefendable? Now, I mean, I've heard reports, I obviously can't confirm them, that Zelensky wanted to pull back from Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, that he saw these as undefendable places. And if you look at the map, I would say that he was right. He apparently also said this attack on Snake Island, which took place in early May, that's a crazy idea. What is going on? Why is the Zelensky circle insistent on standing and fighting for every centimeter of ground? That's one thing. And the other thing is, perhaps since you are in Ukraine, could you tell us a bit about the general mood? I mean, I don't know how far you're able to follow the media there. To what extent it even functions as a media anymore.
Well, let me take your second question first. The media is all bullshit. It's all propagandistic bullshit. Okay. I don't understand what they're saying because I don't understand Russian or Ukrainian. And one of the big problems I've had here in Kharkov is because people speak Russian and Ukrainian kind of like indiscriminately, it's been very difficult to learn either language. You know, it's like a big hodgepodge in my head. Anyway, I'm stupid besides. So, there you go. But the TV media, it's all kinds of bullshit. And you can tell by the body posture, by the body language, it's just peddling bullshit. And the Zelensky regime, since they come from media, they come from marketing, they are particularly sensitive to television. You have you turn on the television, you're going to have multiple channels, and they're all running the same thing, and they're all interviewing the same people. Either it's the same thing or they rotate them through, but it's all propagandistic, and some entertainment programs that are very carefully curated. So it's just, the kind of, the right kind of entertainment, like Turkish soap operas, that sort of thing. Now, so the mass media here, it's all propagandistic bullshit. What I am seeing here in Kharkov, paradoxically enough, I've seen an increase in activity. I've seen more people going to supermarkets, more stores open, more office buildings opening, even as the war is raging really damn close, man. I mean, you can hear the shelling. Most days, all of a sudden, you'll hear this enormous shelling. And I would guesstimate, at a range of 10 to 15 kilometers away. Perhaps it's more. I mean, I'm not trying to pass off any kind of intelligence. I'm just saying my guess. It's roughly from the east. Beyond that, I wouldn't be able to tell you the details. I mean, there are paradoxically far better informed people as to the actual battles outside of Ukraine, outside of Kharkov, than here where I am, right? You do hear the sirens, the air raid sirens go off, every day, just about, at least once. Now, what was your first question? I'm sorry. Oh, why do they
clinging on?
Yeah.
Why does it cling on to undefendable positions and try to recapture lost ground, which is never going to be recaptured?
Yeah, that's easy, but it's not something that that it's easy to surmise if you understand the broader political situation, but it's not something that is being discussed or rumored about. Well, part of it is, and part of it isn't. Let me go through it. The part that is rumored, very quietly, is that Zelensky, for all intents and purposes, is a hostage to a lot of the extremists in his own regime. They don't call it that. They don't treat him as a hostage, but he is a hostage. And if he goes against them, they'll depose him and probably kill him. Okay. As to whether or not they have access to his family, I don't know. I mean, I simply don't know if his family is even in Ukraine at this time. His immediate family, his wife and children. But certainly people such as this, who are, you have to understand, these are ruthless people. They have no trouble at all holding the president hostage and credibly threatening his own family with, his children, his small children, and his wife with some grotesquerie that I wouldn't even want to mention, right? So that is on the table. And so Zelensky will always do what these extremists want to do. People like, what's his name? Yarosh, Arestovich, all these people, they're all crazy. I mean, they're crazy. Okay. You have to understand that. You have to realize that these are the brown shirts of the NAZI regime of the 1930s. Okay. And there was never a night of the long knives. The crazies remained in Ukraine. You have to understand that. Okay. Because the thing about the night of the long knives back in 1933 is that, the bad man with the mustache got rid of the crazy people of his regime, right? Those people were never expunged from the Maidan regime. And so they're still around and they still have weapons. Now, there are multiple rumors going on about these people. Number one, the biggest rumor, and this one I believe it, is that they're skimming off a lot of money from the money they're getting from America, and they are punting a lot of the weapons that they receive to the black market for their own profit. And this is, we are seeing Stinger missiles pop up in all kinds of strange places in the Middle East and in different websites, and it's credible. They have pictures of the weapons, and they're willing to sell them for $15,000. Okay, and so so the group of neo-Nazi thugs around Zelensky, who are criminals, don't call them what they are not. They are criminals. They are holding him hostage. They want to continue this money play. And also they are terrified of surrendering to the Russians. And it seems, here I'm going into my own speculation, and you can agree or disagree or as you see fit. But it seems to me that knowing how they fear the Russians, which they do, and this is known, knowing how they are skimming money from the American aid and the American weapons, which they are doing, the regime around Zelensky is probably afraid because they're so stuck. If they flee, the Americans, who are aware of this corruption, will probably want them. And they certainly can't stick around and surrender to the Russians, because the Russians will grab them and hold trials against them. Because the Russians are obviously, and this is very well known, they are planning to do a whole series of wide open and very transparent court cases, trials against all these people. And I mean, they want that. They want them to be as transparent as possible to give the Russians political cover for the special military operation. And so those trials are coming, and those people around Zelensky are, target number one of the Russians. And so these people don't know where to go. And so from their point of view, prolonging the war as much as possible would be in their best interest. This is my speculation. And here's the second part of my speculation. My speculation is that people like Victoria Nuland, people like Michael McFaul, all these crazy people, the neocons in Washington, they want the war to last as long as possible. And Lloyd Austin said it himself, in order to wear down the Russians. They think that the longer this goes on, the more it hurts the Russians. And if it means fighting to the last Ukrainian in order to, quote unquote, degrade Russia's military, end quote, they'll be happy to do that. And so the Nuland faction, the Blinken faction, the Clintonista neocon faction in Washington is pushing for stand and fight for their reasons, because they think erroneously that it will hurt the Russians when the opposite is the case. And the neo-Nazis around Zelensky want this to continue because they don't know where to go, because they don't have any place to go. And so many times, as Alex, Alexander, and myself, we are men who have had a lot of experience, our own experience, and we've watched other people. And so we've seen when people are in a desperate situation, many times they try to prolong the situation because they realize that there's no real exit. This, I think, is the problem going on with the neo-Nazis around Zelensky. I have to finish off the point. I have to emphasize that Zelensky is a prisoner. He's a hostage. He's not making any decision. Everything he says is scripted and controlled by other people around him or from Washington. So that's. I mean, I'm sorry for the long answer, but I hope I covered your answer.
Yeah, I think you have. I will just add one further point to it, though, which is that I also have to say I think it's partly the need to help the West manage the news about Ukraine. And I think that there's real concern that if Ukraine were to start pulling back from places like Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and Slavyansk and, the more defendable lines, then that would be a very difficult thing to explain to Western public, and very difficult to explain to the Western public why we should continue to support an army that is retreating. Even if that retreat actually makes strategic and it actually makes sense. Now, I've just been going through, while you were speaking, I was just checking what the British media is saying. And they're talking about, how fierce fighting is still going on in Severodonetsk. By the way, and for the record, I think that is actually wrong. I think there is much fighting at the moment in Severodonetsk, because I understand it. What's happened is the Russians have control of the city. There's a number of Ukrainian troops holding out in the industrial area, in the Azot chemical works. And I understand that there's some, skirmishes around the factory. But I understand mostly now there's discussions about how to get these Ukrainian soldiers in the Azot chemical factory, of whom there are apparently a couple of hundred, to actually lay down their arms. So I don't
let me add to that, is that apparently they have about 50 civilian hostages.
That's right. Yeah.
Which again goes to show what kind of despicable people these are.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. But I don't think there is much fighting going on in Severodonetsk at this particular precise moment. No. There's fighting going on in all sorts of other places, but not exactly in Severodonetsk. But it is important for a Western media narrative, for a Western narrative, to give the impression that Ukraine is fighting to defend its territory, even, at the cost of huge losses. Because, as I said, explaining to all those people in Britain who've been putting out, Ukrainian flags outside their doors, and there's not many of those people, but there are some, and you do see it all over. You do see it in, up and down the country, and of course, explaining to the British public why we're going to go on sending more and more money to Ukraine if the Ukrainian army is retreating, is going to be an incredibly difficult sell. So I have a feeling that that plays a part in all of this as well. So I suspect that together with all those internal political figures that you're talking about who are gathered around Zelensky and are telling him, you've got to keep on fighting, you've got to go on fighting in places like Severodonetsk and wherever. I suspect that those people are in kind of de facto alliance with the Western managers, if you like, who also want to keep Ukraine fighting, even if in impossible places. And there is a bizarre paradox in all of this, because the narrative, the explanation, the British media is coming up for the fact that Ukraine is suffering all these enormous losses is because it is defending Severodonetsk. That this heroic battle to hold on to Severodonetsk is causing Ukraine to suffer these enormous losses and to pay this enormous price. Whereas, of course, the logic of that would be retreat from Severodonetsk, spare your troops. That's not, of course, what the media in Britain want to do. So I think that's part of the explanation, which I think isn't really perhaps an obvious one, but I think if you think it through, I think it also makes sense, together with the very important political points you make. How, I think it's probably true that there is tensions between Zelensky and Zelensky and their respective circles, because we've heard this now from so many sources, and there's not been any really convincing denials that one has to say this is almost certainly true. How possible is it that we could see a political breakdown, that these disagreements will burst out into the open?
That's a very, very good question. My personal, there is no word that I'm hearing about this at this time. My personal inclination is to think the following. When the war started, there were a series of assassinations carried out by the SBU or thugs allied to the Zelensky regime. There was the one that I found particularly disturbing of Viktor Struk, who was the mayor of a fairly small town in the Donetsk Oblast. And I posted this on my Twitter. It's I'm looking at it now. There were several. There was Volodymyr Struk. There was also, excuse me, it was not Victor. It was Volodymyr Struk. There was Nestor Shufrik, who was a member of the parliament, whose great crime was calling for bring the boys back home. We don't want war, that kind of thing. And he was picked up by goons, literal goons, trussed up like a turkey. There are famous pictures of him if you look it up, and delivered to the SBU, who smacked him around a little bit and just disappeared him. Nobody knows where he is at this point. And there are other figures, and I was wondering why. What was the point of this? And it became clear over time that the idea was to intimidate any political figure in the current government, as mayors of all these small towns or any other parliamentarian, to intimidate them into being completely pro-Zelensky. Zelensky later on outlawed all opposition parties. Every single party opposed to Zelensky, not opposed to the war, opposed to Zelensky. And it's completely authoritarian. What the regime that has emerged is far from being democratic. But I was wondering about that, about all these things, and it's clear that it was just an effort to mark the territory moving forward in this conflict. I think that the army or the leadership, they must be very, very nervous about these people around Zelensky who have the ruthlessness to carry out these assassinations as they did preemptively, prophylactically, if you will. And I think that the possibility of a coup d'etat, of course, it's crossed their minds. But I think that this Zelensky regime is ruthless enough and cunning enough to have made sure that that would be very, very difficult. If you look historically, when there is a coup d'etat in a country where the military has been cowed, it's usually a colonel a colonel or a very, very junior general who's the one who steps forward. Look at Gaddafi. Look at Napoleon. I'm not comparing these men, of course. I'm not saying that Gaddafi was a Napoleon figure, but look at them when they took power. They were relatively junior officers. They were not the senior leaders, because the senior leaders are afraid, and it's the younger echelon, the colonels, who have both the ruthlessness and the devil-may-care attitude to carry out a coup against the established authority. And the established authority in Ukraine at this time, the Zelensky regime and the people around him, are extraordinarily ruthless. And so the possibility of overthrowing Zelensky at this time is not really clear, even as it is becoming increasingly clear to me, and this is important what I'm about to say. It seems clear that the Biden administration and the West is slowly but surely digging the grave for Zelensky. I'm starting to see in the press a lot of little signs that they're going to start pointing the finger at Zelensky for the loss of Ukraine. And very, very slowly, they're starting very gently to start to criticize him. They haven't criticized him for things that are very well known, like for the fact that he has a $585 million fortune outside of Ukraine, mansions in Israel, in Italy, and in Miami. And nobody in the Western press is mentioning that at all. But slowly, they're starting to criticize Saint Zelensky. I think that the Biden administration is realizing that they need a way to blame this all on somebody. And I think that Zelensky himself will be the sacrificial lamb. But at this time, the possibility of a coup d'etat, it's not clear. It might happen, it might not. But if there is an attempt at a coup, the people around Zelensky are very, very ruthless, and they will smother the coup plotters in such a vicious way that I think that might be the reason why we have not had a coup so far.
Can I just add to that list of colonels who launched coups, one who attempted to launch a coup which failed, who was of course Stauffenberg, and that was the attempted coup and assassination of the mustachio gentleman. And as we know,
what was the name of the French guy over Algeria who tried to stage a coup against de Gaulle back in?
I don't remember, but yeah,
you know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about. So there we go. Now, shall we pivot, if you don't mind, to the east, to China?
Oh, yes.
Because we've had this extraordinary meeting between the Americans and the Chinese in Singapore, and like many of these meetings that now take place between the Chinese and the Americans, I'm never completely sure what the purpose of these meetings actually are. There seems to be an attempt to maintain some kind of dialogue, except what they invariably do is that instead of the two sides coming together and having a meeting of minds, they come away more angry and more embittered with each other.
Yeah.
And I am one of those people who actually reads the Chinese media. And by the way, it's not particularly difficult if you will always understand its political biases, which are not hidden. I mean, they're quite there in the open. But it's been very remarkable to see over the time that we've been working the Duran. We started the Duran in 2016. It's been very remarkable to see the shift, because back in 2016 and way up until about 2018, 2019, the Chinese were talking about the partnership with the United States. China's partnership with the United States, that they were getting on with the US, that the United States and China, well, they might have differences about all kinds of things. They might take different views about, big issues, the the Iraq war, for example. But, overall, this is a win-win relationship. The assumption on the Chinese side was that exactly the Chinese side was, well, we're exactly friends, but it made so much commercial and economic sense that we must preserve it. And then about 2019, you start to see a shift, which is when Trump starts making decisions which the Chinese don't like, and they suddenly realize, well, this is a president who's actually going to start pushing back on economic things, and they start to become a bit more critical. But they become more critical. Pompeo comes along, Bolton come along. They do various things in Hong Kong, or the Chinese believe they do, which amounts to the same thing. The Chinese become more critical still. And then Biden comes. Now, Biden, I think, is somebody that the Chinese initially welcomed. After all, he's had all kinds of good relations with the Chinese, as we know. And he's had some, shall we say, very, mutually advantageous relations with the Chinese. I'm not going to say more because we must remember which platform we're on. So the Chinese, I think, were quite happy to see Biden elected. And the extraordinary thing is to see how over the last couple of months, last year and a bit, since Biden was elected, Chinese-US relations have crashed. I mean, they sagged under Trump. Now they have got far worse than I could conceive of or have imagined, and at a speed which is startling. And we've had this extraordinary succession of disastrous meetings, like the one that happened last year between the US and Chinese foreign policy teams in, I think it was Anchorage, where the Chinese just bulldozed over Blinken and his team. And ever since then, it's got steadily worse. And of course, we talk a lot about Taiwan. Taiwan seems to be the major issue. I can't help but think that fundamentally there is now within the administration, from the neocon side of it, if you like, this desire to somehow push China back to, China is the great adversary, even more than Russia. We must break it or contain it in some way. And one almost gets a sense sometimes of the US goading the Chinese over Taiwan. And this is so strange because the Chinese were not happy with domestic political developments in Taiwan. They don't like the current government there at all. They don't think, they don't like its moves towards independence. But they weren't going to start a war over it. And they wouldn't have done if they thought that the Americans would just leave the situation alone. But the US is not leaving it alone. It's constantly taking steps which suggest support for some kind of Taiwanese independence, and also military backing for Taiwan in the event that Taiwan gets into a confrontation with China. And that, the last, is something that the Chinese, of course, cannot tolerate. And there was this disastrous summit meeting in Singapore when the US and Chinese defense teams, and these people you would have thought would be the ones who would be anxious to pull things and settle things, they meet. And from what I can see, it ended in rather strong words exchanged, but with the Americans going away, saying that the Chinese weren't taking a particularly strong line on Taiwan. They weren't saying anything new about Taiwan. And of course, that comes out publicly. And the Chinese are furious. And they're going around saying this isn't a fair representation of what happened in Singapore at all. And the reality is that we're giving the Americans one warning after another about Taiwan. So it's very strange that we have these meetings. Each meeting cumulatively is making the situation worse. And I worry that just as we had a war in Ukraine, which is supposed to lead to a sanctions attack on Russia, which is expected to lead to the collapse of the Russian government and Putin's regime and all of that, I worry that the same kind of agenda is being followed with China. And I think it's wrong. I don't think China would buckle at all in that kind of way. And I think that we are absolutely in no position to have that kind of massive second front, which, by the way, would then be the main front that a confrontation with America between the US and China would
Yeah.
involve. But there's nothing like enough discussion about this. The Europeans are blind. They're following again where the neocons in the US are leading them. And it seems to me that by the day, meeting after meeting, you can almost see the steps towards a crisis growing.
Yeah. Yeah. My thinking is that, yeah, we're having a repeat of Ukraine in over Taiwan. It's the exact same thing, where they keep goading and goading the dominant power in the region over this. I mean no disrespect to either the Taiwanese people or the Ukrainian people, but these trivial countries that are within the scope, the sphere of influence of these dominant regional powers. I mean, whatever you think of Russia, whatever you think of China, they are the dominant regional powers in their respective spheres. To goad them is pointless. Now, the Americans did it with Ukraine. Here we are. The Americans are doing it with Taiwan. Soon enough, we're going to be at the exact same place where we are here, where China goes forward and invades Taiwan. Perhaps not really wanting to, but I read this morning, by the way, some moves that the Xi regime is doing to basically declare certain moves and certain concentration of troops that they are carrying out, that they are non-military. Like they issued a decree talking about the military being used for non-military policing purposes. It seems that they're creating the legal framework by way of the Chinese version of a special military operation to go into Taiwan and take it. Now, the thing is, I think that we have a bigger problem in China. I mean, it's analogous because on the one hand, just as Russia was crucial for Europe and the Europeans only realized it after the fact, China is crucial for the American economy, and they're only going to realize it after the fact. Okay. And they're going to do the stupid sanctions again or something like it, or the Chinese might sanction the Americans. That would be an interesting twist. But either way, the American economy will suffer catastrophically the way that the European economy is suffering catastrophically. Okay, but here is the difference. I think that the Pentagon, the United States is a naval power. That's where its real power lies. It has never been a military with great land armies, the way the Russians have always been nations with great land armies. The Russians, they have a navy, but it's not really that important to them. What's important to them is the ground troops. Just as for the Americans, it's their aircraft carriers. That's where they feel that they project real American power. I suspect that the Pentagon might be more on board with a war with China and assisting Taiwan directly, i.e., going directly against China. I think also that we will likely see some sort of crisis with Taiwan before October, precisely because of the catastrophic elections that are coming up in November that the Biden administration does not want to face. And they might be thinking, in their bizarre, misguided notions, that a war with China might help the Democrats and the Biden administration in the November elections. Look, these people think this way. These people are idiots, okay? But my point is that, we might have this war, and the war, the Chinese have said so repeatedly, that they will not tolerate a declaration of Taiwanese independence or a recognition of Taiwan's independence. They will not allow it. And I think that will be the moment that, it happens. I think it will happen, quite frankly. And I think that the neocons, they have never met a conflict that they didn't want to escalate.
Yes.
The Pentagon now might be thinking, well, we couldn't really take on the Russians because they're a great land power, but we can have a quote unquote positive impact on developments in Taiwan, end quote, in their stupid phraseology, their newspeak, Orwellian garbage speak, and decide to throw the dice on the side of Taiwan and go head to head against the Chinese. And that would be a catastrophe, because the Chinese on the very first day are going to sink 2 American aircraft carriers because they have the power to do that. And the Americans don't quite seem to realize it. And they're going rudderless into this conflict with the Chinese, and they're going to lose catastrophically. I mean, that's my reading of the situation. Do you agree or disagree?
I agree, but I'm going to just add one enormous qualifier, which I think you're absolutely right, that the Pentagon is much better structured to fight a naval war, because that's where historically America's strengths are.
Yeah.
But if you look at the leadership of the Pentagon today, both Lloyd Austin and Mark Milley, are soldiers. They are not naval people. And I wonder whether they fully understand the point you're making about the fact that these American aircraft carriers, with the Chinese now developing hypersonic anti-ship missiles and ballistic launched anti-ship missiles, that these aircraft carriers are becoming increasingly vulnerable. And, you know, I do worry about the extent to which the US, parts of the US military, grasp how dangerous this situation potentially is becoming. I'm going to add something else, and it's a point that goes back to, you know, the economic consequences of a confrontation with China, which is that somebody has made a very, very correct comment, actually. I mean, you know, it was one of the comments that I've seen coming up about the fact that Taiwan is also crucial to the US economy because of the way in which it is so important. I mean, it's important in many things, but its key importance is in the fact that it makes the most advanced, it's where the most advanced microprocessors are made. And there is no immediate and obvious substitute for it. So, you know, you would need to keep that flow from Taiwan running. Now, the point is that just, again, doesn't seem to be understood, that a war potentially could massively disrupt the US electronics industry at this time. And that is very much a feature of neocon thinking. Now, for my students, because, well, it's what we do now here on the Duran, I read a lot of neocon literature. I have to. The one thing that I always find astonishing about them is that they never look at economics. They never discuss them. They never really grasp supply chain issues, logistics, the way industries interrelate with each other. We talked at the start of the program about not thinking these things through. The problem with the neocons is that there is this sublime belief they seem to have in unlimited US power, that the US can simply will something and it will happen. And that therefore you don't need to worry about resources. All you need to worry is about what's in the US interests and, you know, the usual, we're going to use a rude word, but the usual things about values and whatever it is that the neocons love to cloak their various plans under. And I don't think they've grasped that, you know, if there was a conflict with China, yes, the Chinese economy would suffer severe knocks, but so would that of the US. And, you know, the Chinese, they've got the Russians behind them. The Russians will provide them with oil, with coal, with all those things eventually. I mean, you know, they no doubt have problems, but they get by. The US is looking in less good shape, really, to adapt quickly to that kind of crisis. I know there's some people who won't agree, but that's how it looks to me again. So I don't think the neocons ever understand this, that there are limits to what the US can do. There are limits to what any power, great power, is able to do. Imperial Rome found that it had limits too. And so does the United States. It's not something to be embarrassed or ashamed of. It's the reality.
It's a little bit the mentality of small children who have grown up with well-to-do parents, and they don't quite recognize the limits of their parents' financial resources. They think that those resources are limitless and that they can spend them in an irresponsible way, and that somehow magically they'll be all solved. I mean, that's what it reminds me of, quite frankly. I don't know if that metaphor.
It works, having actually seen that happen in practice a number of times.
Me too.
But I mean, I completely agree. I mean, it's like young people who come into a huge inheritance.
And
they don't understand that an inheritance has to be managed. You can't just spend it according to whim. It doesn't work like that. You've got to be careful and prudent. And yes, you can live a very, very good life, but you can't just do whatever you want. And the neocons think they can do whatever they want, or rather that the US can. So, there's a very famous, what it used to be a very famous poem that came out in Britain during the Second World War, the early part of the Second World War. And it was, about, let's march on Batumi in what was then the Soviet Union, that sees that, problem with all these neutrals that get in the way. And, we'll send armies here and we'll send armies there and we'll do all of these things. And of course, the point is it's parodic because, of course, it ridicules a type of strategic thinking which takes no account of resources, shows no real understanding of constraints of supplies and things of that kind, and and just thinks that you can run war in this kind of fantastic way, and that anything you desire is achievable by you. And the neocons are like this. And the extraordinary thing is, the more they fail, the less they see. It's very weird. I mean, you'd have thought that after Iraq and the Middle East debacle that they would be a bit more careful, but they're not. And so they're now crashing into a confrontation with China. The one with Russia hasn't turned out at all as they've expected.
No.
Now they're going to we're risking a real crisis with China. And I don't get the sense that, again, anybody is applying the brakes.
No, there's also the about the neocons doubling down on their bad bets. You're right. There was the Afghanistan debacle, and they sort of tried to ignore it and shuffle it off the stage and turn their attention to Ukraine, which is an even bigger debacle. And they're going to ignore it and shuffle it off the stage and turn to Taiwan, which is going to be a catastrophe. And here's something that I listened to Professor Mearsheimer. His first name is Walter, right? I always forget. I always just see Mearsheimer. Yeah. Well, smart man, and he was the one saying at the beginning, this is a disaster. He was saying from 2015 that the NATO expansion was just setting up Ukraine to be overrun by the Russians. I mean, he basically laid out everything that we have seen over the last 100 days or so. And the point of Mearsheimer, he said this just a few days ago, that what he was scared, and what has scared me for several months now, is how the neocons are treating nuclear war in a cavalier way. That is what scares me silly, quite frankly. And that's my concern. I used to think that maybe these people would resort to nuclear weapons because they kept projecting onto Putin that Putin was going to use nuclear weapons. And of course, Putin has no interest whatsoever in using nuclear weapons. He doesn't need to. He's winning, And so they were projecting onto Putin that he would use nuclear weapons. And I thought that, and I said this repeatedly, I did videos and live streams about this, saying that I thought that the Americans / Zelensky regime people would stage some sort of false flag that would give the justification for the use of chemical or nuclear weapons by the West in Ukraine against Russia, and then there all bets are off. That's what I was thinking. I actually thought for a while that the alleged massacre at that neighborhood we shall not name because of reasons, of censorship reasons, well, that might have been the false flag, but it never quite rose to that level because there were enough loose threads that people were like, wait, this doesn't quite sound logical, and that whole narrative fell apart. But my thinking is this now with the China situation. If the Chinese sink an aircraft carrier, and parenthetically, the Chinese are dreaming about doing this ever since 1996, when Bill Clinton foolishly had an aircraft carrier battle group go up and down the Taiwan Strait, almost like flipping the bird at the Chinese authority. It is something that they consider a loss of face, and they want revenge for that. And I don't think that in the West they have any idea how provocative that single move was and how catastrophic, because the Chinese dream about sinking at least one aircraft carrier, hopefully more. If the Chinese succeed in this dream of sinking an aircraft carrier, I believe that the neocons, in this cavalier attitude of the rich kid inheriting so much money, of the people manipulating enormous power which they did not earn, because that's what's going on, that in their stupidity and their arrogance and hubris, they might use nuclear weapons against China. That is my true fear. I thought that this might happen during the Ukraine-Russia conflict, but now, as we are starting to see the straightaway in this global conflict, and I know that this sounds crazy, but crazy stuff has happened in the last 2 years. I mean, if you were to go back to the end of 2019, could you imagine what has happened so far? No. I do believe that the American neocon regime will resort to nuclear weapons if a U.S. aircraft carrier is sunk. That is my enormous fear.
Well, I have to say I share your fear. I hope it doesn't come to that. I don't know how strong, whether that hope may be misplaced. And coming back to the person that you mentioned earlier, Radek Sikorski, who is of course married, I believe I'm right, that he's married to Anne Applebaum, who is one of the prominent
the most
in the
crazy
US.
lady. I mean, that lady flies around on a broomstick, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I mean, talking about giving Ukraine nuclear weapons. I mean, how anybody could talk about such a thing, it is incredibly disturbing. I have to say, I would be more worried about the US doing something utterly reckless, which is, I don't want to put any ideas in anybody's head, but giving nuclear weapons itself to third parties, like Sikorski suggested with Ukraine, basically tearing up the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has worked very much in the US favor in a crisis, and saying, look, if we're going to lose a carrier, the way we're going to respond is by giving the green light for certain countries in the Pacific to become nuclear powers. Now, were that to happen, I mean, that would be an absolute disaster. That would be a catastrophe.
Excuse me, Alexander, do you think that they would give the nuclear weapons as a deterrent or to actively use?
I think the second. I think the danger would be the second.
Because it makes sense to give them to Australia, maybe. But why give them to Australia?
Well,
I'm just thinking out loud.
Well, Australia wouldn't have any use for them because it's securely within, it's far away also from China. But one can think of certain countries. Again, I don't want to name those countries, but I'm sure we can all put names to them without much difficulty. Countries close to China or reasonably close to China, with histories with China, which might be, I mean, in the case of an island nation, which is going through severe economic difficulties, it undoubtedly has the capabilities to develop its own nuclear weapons and do so very quickly. So, that's one possible, and that's one possibility, that you could just give them the green light to do it. And of course, if we're talking about another island nation, which is the topic of this conversation, well, of course, that might be the way to get revenge.
Do you think that they'll just give them over, like Sikorski suggested?
I think in the case of the second country, I don't think it has a nuclear weapons development capability, at least not in the time frame that would be needed to change things. The first one, it's a different matter. I think it probably could. I mean, I've heard that there are only a few, all the components there. All they need to do is to basically put them together.
Yeah, that's what I've heard too.
So I think that would be. I think that would be an incredibly dangerous thing. And of course, the Chinese response just doesn't even bear thinking about in that case. I think that the Chinese would probably respond very, very rapidly before before anything like that happened, before these plans
Oh
could be
yeah.
put into actual effect. And I mean, we would be seeing an escalation at that point on this, you know, from the Chinese side, a counter escalation to the American, which would be just, I mean, we would be in close to a World War III scenario at that point.
Alexander, you're in basic agreement with me that
Yeah.
the war with China and the U.S. is like inevitable at this point?
Well, I have to say, it's increasingly looking this way. I mean, Garland Nixon, who's a man who I have huge respect for, he actually wrote to me. He said, this is a very, very dangerous administration. Look at what's happened in Ukraine. Look at what's happening in the Gulf. But look, first of all, now at how they are doing all sorts of crazy things with respect to China. I mean, you know, a couple of weeks ago, they were changing what was said about Taiwan on the State Department's website. Now, they then wrote it back. But the very fact that they did it at all, in effect, talking about Taiwan as an independent country and appearing to cast doubt on the one China policy, was bound to provoke Beijing. And of course, we've had this most extraordinary summit meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden, which was the last summit meeting they had, which was, I think, in January this year, or it might have been at the end of last year. And note, we haven't had any follow-up meetings since then, which suggests that the Chinese are very, very unhappy about things, the way things went. But I read the Chinese readout of that conversation, and Chinese readouts of conversations between their officials and American officials are incredibly long. They go into massive detail. And you could see Xi Jinping telling Biden, look, you're telling me one thing about Taiwan in private, and then your administration goes and does the opposite. When the moment our discussion, our discussion between each other ends, you give me all kinds of assurances about Taiwan, and those assurances actually mean nothing, because your administration then goes ahead and essentially breaks those assurances. That is the closest I have ever seen a readout between leaders come close to say, which I'm sure is what Xi Jinping did actually say to Biden. You are lying to me.
Yeah.
You are lying to me about Taiwan. You are telling me one thing and you're doing the opposite.
Yeah.
Now, that suggests a total breakdown of trust.
I insofar as the okay, let me step back. Putin has relentlessly said for a couple of years now that the West is agreement incapable. And of course, Xi and Putin have a very strong working relationship. And of course, it's not merely at the level of head of state, but it's also at the ministerial level, sub-ministerial level, and so on down the bureaucratic ladder. And so the Chinese and the Russians have been working hand in glove on all sorts of different issues. Of course, they don't see eye to eye on every single thing, but it's like normal partnership issues. Putin, of course, will advise Xi on issues relating to dealing with the West and the United States. And Putin is the one who has said, you cannot trust the Americans because anything they say, they'll go back on. He's been saying this for a number of years to Xi because he's been saying it in public practically. And so now Xi is in the January meeting, he basically said, yeah, Putin was right about you guys, you know? And
absolutely.
And so, you know, if you don't have trust in your counterparty, you can have no way to create a durable peace. This is why it's a catastrophe. Because, see, it's one thing to be ruthless. It's one thing to be sort of like, you know, shifty. But if you say something, you have to stick with it. But if you can't trust the person to say something and stick with it, then you have no future with that person or that nation, as in this case. That's my thinking.
You're absolutely right. On the subject of Putin and Biden. Now, this was not in the Russian readout of the actual conversation, but we actually know it because Putin himself clarified it later. Apparently, they were talking about Ukraine, and Biden was giving his usual, as you correctly say, slippery assurances about the fact that Ukraine isn't, that there's no plan for Ukraine to join NATO. And then apparently Putin said, when you tell me that you have no plan for Ukraine to join NATO, but you refuse to say that Ukraine will not join NATO, the only conclusion I can draw is that Ukraine is going to join NATO, and you know it. Apparently, that's what Putin said to Biden.
Yep.
Now, I don't know what Slippery Joe said in response, but it is incredibly destructive in conversations, in discussions between leaders, to conduct them in that kind of way. It would have been actually much better over Ukraine for the United States to have been straightforward about what its intentions with Ukraine were. And the same, by the way, to a great extent is true about Taiwan. If the United States had been straightforward about Ukraine and straightforward about Taiwan, obviously that would have provoked a crisis with Russia and China. But as a result of that crisis, we might have had a productive discussion about the whole situation in the West. These deceptions are not fooling the Chinese. They're not fooling the Russians. They're just creating massive distrust of us with the Chinese and the Russians. But what they are doing, and it's very dangerous, is that they're fooling and deceiving Western publics so that the Western publics do not understand how dangerous the situation is becoming and how our leaders are leading us into a conflict which we're simply not ready for.
Yeah, it's a little bit like the situation in 1941 when the United States imposed all sorts of sanctions on Imperial Japan and blockaded it and did all no, it didn't blockade it, but it prohibited issues of oil exports and other issues that were directly affecting Japan and made the attack on Pearl Harbor kind of like inevitable. And then the American public was like shocked that this happened for no reason whatsoever. It's a standard American doctrine to hide from its own public what its government is doing to provoke a war. And then there's a spectacular attack, and the American public are all shocked, and this happened for no reason, and they did this because they hate our freedoms. Because 9/11. Why did 9/11 happen? Because they just didn't like the buildings? No, because the United States had been acting grotesquely in the Middle East, and the hatred of so many people in the Middle East now for the United States is not only because of what happened pre 9/11, but what happened post, and the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth, Syria. The American public are constantly shielded by the American regime that carries out despicable actions that provoke, and then they're always surprised, like it happened for no reason whatsoever. That's something that drives me a little bit up the wall. But oh, by the way, there was some comment saying, that maybe to solve inflation, the dollar should be pegged to the ruble. I thought that was very witty. and maybe a good idea.
Might even be a good idea. Might be what will happen eventually. Given how things are turning out. I mean, I have to say, a conflict in the Middle East with Iran at this time, we absolutely do not need.
But what's that all about?
With China, well, that's probably a topic for another program. But a conflict with China is just a cataclysm. I mean, that is beyond crazy. And to drift into a conflict like that without thinking it through, those famous words of Wolfgang Munchau about the Ukrainian crisis, well, that's even more reckless. And we cannot think it through if it's brought about in this hole in the corner, deceptive, sly, slippery way. Because, of course, the effect of that is that we can't have a proper discussion about this. We can't all sit down. We can't have the industry people, the business people, those sorts of people saying, well, look, if you want to get into a conflict with China, do understand this, that, and the other is going to happen. And we've no real response to those things. In fact, what happened with Ukraine is that they'd already made their decision about the sanctions. They went through the motions then of consulting just in, a couple of weeks before the sanctions were going to be imposed. They got very annoyed that the people in the industries were telling them things they didn't want to hear. The oil industry was telling them the market is tight. There's no replacement for Russian oil and gas. The people in the finance world were telling them, don't cut off Russia from SWIFT. So they simply shut all those conversations, all those discussions down, and they didn't speak to the Fed. They didn't inform the Fed in advance of what they were going to do. And we're heading into the same mess with China. And again, I will always say this: Trump had a policy with China. He wanted to push back on China's manufacturing exports. He wanted to essentially restart a process of reindustrialization within the United States. He felt also that the Chinese had taken advantage, and to some extent they had. And, I don't even criticize the Chinese for doing that. Why should they not take advantage when the opportunities are provided to them to do so? But anyway, that's what he wanted to do. And the Chinese were annoyed and they were angry, but at the same time, they did understand it. But this administration has infuriated them. It has got under their skin in a way that Donald Trump, I can say confidently, never did. So
what's crucial, I think, is that they respected Trump. They understood where he's coming from, and they respected him. But they don't have respect for the Biden administration because they think they're stupid, which is very dangerous, actually.
Well, it is absolutely so. But as we're heading to a crisis at a time when we ought to be focusing all our attention and energies on getting on top of this very, very difficult economic whirlwind that we've brought ourselves into. And of course, the first thing we need to do in order to get that sorted is to end this sanctions war. We need to do what those Greek ship owners were saying. We've got to start acting rationally in economic terms. And it's going to be enormously difficult because the accumulated mistakes of 30 plus years have left us with a very, very difficult economic legacy to work through. Well, I've had my say, Gonzalo, today. I don't know, do you want to round off and then...
Yes,
Alex,
one last
because
issue.
we've done 2 hours now, over 2 hours. So yeah.
I just want the last point I want to make is that, see, I agree with everything you've said so far. Like I always say, great minds think alike. My also further thoughts are that there is a segment of the economic intelligentsia, if you want to call it that, in the United States. People around like Paul Krugman. He's the figure that is most obvious. They genuinely believe that a war would be beneficial to the American economy. And they are very subtly, but very decisively pushing towards a war. And I think that they're going to see a war with China, bizarre as it is. They think that it will help them. People like Paul Krugman, people like Brad DeLong, they foolishly think that the Second World War was what brought the United States out of the Great Depression. They know that this is not accurate, that in many ways the Great Depression was exacerbated by the very policies carried out by the Franklin Roosevelt administration. Certainly the 37 recession / mini depression was caused by the Roosevelt administration. But these Keynesian economists believe that World War II solved the Great Depression. And so maybe a good big war would be good for the American economy, which is insane on a moral level. I mean, you're talking about going to war in order to become richer as a country. What the hell is the matter with you? At least, insofar as a republic is concerned. But it's the wrong lesson to take from the Second World War. But that's the lesson these people have, and that's why I think that they might be, from the academic economist side, they are goading for a big war to solve all the problems.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, Krugman, in my opinion, has been one of the most disastrous economic advisors, if I could put it like that we see. I mean, he's once upon a time in another universe long ago, he was actually a real economist. I mean, he's now become, as far as I can see, a shill. And he was a shill for money printing. He said, he was somebody who said, inflation was never going to take off. There was never any problems with unlimited QE. He wanted all those things. He's got them. It's all going wrong. But of course, it's somebody else's fault. The Republicans are to blame. And, let's start a war with China and that will solve all our problems. And I'm afraid you're right. I mean, one of the problems with this administration is that it follows too much. It's far too much under the spell of a certain type of economist. And Krugman is only one example of this. There's a whole gaggle of them, especially in the US. You find fewer of them in Britain. And I'm afraid they've had a very, very damaging influence because they've essentially forgotten many of the very simple, basic things about how economies ought to be run. I mean, the running an economy is not an easy thing at all, ever. But you've got to always understand, budgets need ultimately to balance. You can't just print money until forever. You can't do these sort of things that these people did. It's the same mistake as the neocons make at a geopolitical level. These economists do at an economic level. They think that you can will the end and you don't have to worry too much about the means.
Exactly right.
Okay, well, I think we've had a phenomenal discussion. As I said, I think we are at a tipping point, inflection point, as I think Joe Biden, the president of the United States, said, but I think he meant it in a very different way from the one we're meaning here. But I will also quickly say, I would just quickly add something which I would like to just mention, which is that I can remember this conversation Alex and I had well before the election, the American election, the presidential election, when Biden was only a candidate. And I remember him saying that, America's going to be the real problems are going to begin if Biden is ever elected president of the United States. And at that time, neither of us, I seem to remember, thought it was going to happen because it seemed too improbable that it would be so. Well, it did happen. And Alex's predictions have proved entirely true.
Yeah, and I just shudder to think about what's going to happen in this upcoming midterm elections in November.
Yeah.
I think the shenanigans are going to be off the charts on all levels, and I have to insist. This might be incredibly cynical on my part, but I'll just say it because this is what I think at this time, that the Biden administration will deliberately go to war with China just to win these midterm elections. Well, it's something that I can't get out of my head as a suspicion.
Well, they raised the stakes to such extraordinary levels. I mean, if you listen to the way they talk, the whole future of democracy, our democracy in America depends on it. So given that is so, if you're going to save democracy by starting a war with the biggest economy in the world, well, we do it, I suppose. Anyway, there we are. Thanks again. It was a fantastic program. Alex, anything you want to just round off?
Do you want to? Yeah. Do you guys want to go over super chats, or do you want to answer them in a separate show?
Well, I've got time.
I mean, what's your time? What's your?
I have about 7 more minutes. Yeah, but okay. I'd be happy for
Alexander.
I could do some. Yeah, I could do about an hour. I suppose I could probably do it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's just. You have 7 minutes. You said, Gonzalo.
Yeah, but I mean, it depends on something that's going to happen. So I'll be monitoring it, and when I have to pop off.
Well, let's just get to a lot of different questions. Just Just stop me, Gonzalo, when you need to go. That's
Okay.
fine. The big question that a lot of people are asking, and it was a couple of super chats, I think, were asking it, was about Odessa.
Yeah.
Well, you guys didn't touch upon Odessa at all.
Oh yeah, it's
No.
And of course, a lot of people have a lot of interest in Odessa, as do I.
Yeah, I personally think it's going to fall. What I think will happen is that once the Donbass battle is over, and the Ukrainian army has been dispatched in that area, the Russian army will focus on Nikolaev, and I think that what they're going to do is they're going to have a strong push to get to Transnistria. That seems the reasonable approach, and cut off Odessa, not assault it. I think that the Russians will decide that if they control the Black Sea and they have cut it off on the north by crossing over and around Odessa, Odessa will eventually fall of its own weight, and they won't really have to assault it. I don't think the Russians want to assault it, because for them it's a psychologically and culturally very significant city. And so they will do their utmost to protect it insofar as not damaging it or hurting the populace. That's what I think at this time. But also, I do have to preface this: if there's a colossal loss in the Battle of the Donbass, anything can happen. It could be that the entire Ukrainian state just collapses at that moment. There is a definitive battle where it's clear that the Russians have won, and it's a tipping point or a breaking point, or call it what you will. It could be that the entire Ukrainian nation, the entire armed forces of Ukraine collapses, because this seems to happen, and it happens all at once. It's all of a sudden the whole thing just collapses. So we'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, we've discussed Odessa in previous programs. I'll just repeat what I've said before. I cannot imagine that there is any conceivable Russian plan for Ukraine that doesn't take into account Odessa, that doesn't include Odessa. I mean, given how important Odessa is economically, symbolically, culturally, and of course, bear in mind that it's a Russian city. I mean, it's a predominantly Russian city. I mean, I just cannot conceive that the Russians will end their, whatever it is they're doing in Ukraine, without resolving the issue of Odessa. I don't think, by the way, this is properly understood in the West. Certainly isn't understood in Britain. But I think that anybody who knows how important Odessa is to the Russians, I mean, read their literature, read, people like Isaac Babel, listen to their music. They're some of their greatest performers. So there's an extraordinary violin school, for example, a school of violin playing that began in Odessa. It is inconceivable to me. Eisenstein, and the Odessa Steps. It is inconceivable to me that the Russians will not, resolve the issue of Odessa in a way that is satisfactory to them. And I'm not sure what plan they have. I'm not sure that they've even themselves worked out all the details of the plan. But of that, I have absolutely no doubt. They will certainly not, let Odessa stay as is.
Yeah, I would say that at this time, it's very obvious that what was Ukraine will be dismembered. And it is very clear that the land bridge from what was Russia to Crimea will remain all in Russian hands. Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson. It's certainly, by that same token, they will go for Odessa. I do believe that Kharkov, where I'm currently located, will also become a part of Russia. The only doubt I have at this time is, frankly, Dnipro, or formerly Dnipropetrovsk. That's the only region that I would be wondering whether it will remain a part of Ukraine or will be annexed by Russia. But annexed, occupied, stolen, conquered, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
I think that large swath of land, which corresponds to roughly 1/3 of Ukrainian territory, I do believe that it will become a part of Russia permanently. And it will never be pried out. Yes.
On the topic of Dnipro, I would simply say this: every single statement about it made by Russian officials refers to the place as Dnipropetrovsk. In other words, they continue to use the old Russian name for the place. Now, that again suggests to me that it's going to be included in whatever new vision of Ukraine and Russia that they have. I don't think that they will let Dnipropetrovsk or Dnipro go, but obviously it doesn't have the importance of Odessa or indeed of Kharkiv, which is an important city as well. I mean, it's an important industrial city.
It's a traditionally Russian city.
It's a traditionally Russian city. It's the place where the T-34 tank was born, as Russians never cease to remind me. And I don't know if people are aware. I mean, there's a very famous Soviet film called Time Forward with an extraordinary signature tune, which became, the sort of signature tune of Soviet external broadcasts. Really wonderful tune, actually. But the point was, it was a competition between two Russian cities as to who would be able to build the factory fastest. This is in the 30s. It's set in the 30s. And of course, the two Russian cities in competition with each other are Magnitogorsk and Kharkiv.
New Guardian wants to know, Coach, will you and or family be getting a Russian passport?
Well, I won't. I don't have a Ukrainian passport, and I'm set for passports. Thanks. No, I'm not going to get any foreign passport from anybody. As I've always emphasized, I am an impartial observer to this conflict. I happen to be in the middle of it, but I do not have any side. I've always been very clear about that. My only concern is to minimize the loss of life needlessly, because I understand that conflict can emerge and that sometimes these conflicts require a clash, a physical, kinetic clash, if you want to call it that. But my only concern is to minimize the loss of life. But other than that,
Commander Crossfire says, to think just 30 years after losing half their population, half their land, and total economic collapse, and Russia successfully facing down the U.S. both militarily and surviving economically resilient is a major understatement.
Yes.
Absolutely. Can I go on?
No, you go ahead. Say something?
No. I don't.
Yeah, I do want to. I would like to say something. One effect of this conflict is it's going to completely change Russians' self-perception of themselves. I mean, ever since, not just the fall of the Soviet Union, even before then, they've become very cynical. Their confidence, their self-confidence, which has been very high in the 50s and 60s as people who traveled there, had been draining away. People become cynical, exhausted by the Soviet system, weary of their leaders. They'd come to think of themselves as a second-class country. And what's going to happen as a result of this war is that they're going to wake up and they're going to suddenly realize the extent of their own power. And that's going to be quite a thing. Now, the nearest approximation to that in modern history is what happened during the Second World War with the United States. When the United States went into the Second World War, still very much the country that was going through the Depression, and there was still a lot of self-doubt in the United States. And it came out the other end, brimming with self-confidence. Well, we're going to see something similar.
I think also that this might, I agree with everything you said, Alexander. I also think that this might be a turning point demographically for Russia. Because a lot of people have said that Russia is like, its population growth has been diminishing, but slowly in the years prior to this war, it's been slowly upticking in terms of children per women. I think that because of this war, and very especially because of the grotesque and rather savage divorce that the West inflicted on Russia, a lot of people in Russia will feel, the values of the West are not our values, are not Russian values. Let's go back to Russian values and become a much more traditional society and turn away from that Western approach to family, to society, to the social life. And we're already starting to see it. There are a lot of videos that I've seen of returning Russian soldiers, proposing marriage to their sweethearts. And it's becoming like a little mini genre. I think that we might see a baby boom in Russia after this war.
It would not surprise me. It would not surprise me at all. But as I said, I'll come back to what I said. The fact that Russia has absorbed everything that the West has thrown at it. I mean, the fact that, sanctions, oil bans, embargoes, all of those things, and it's come out successful. The Russians themselves, like Navalny, are astonished by it. And as I said, they'll need to be very careful it doesn't go to their head.
Commander Crossfire says, Macron says France has entered a war economy. Meanwhile, Russia has lowered their interest rates again, raised minimum wage, and reopened McDonald's.
Thank you, Monsieur Macron. I mean, that's all I can say. I mean, given the state of France. Now, as I said, I used to know France very well. I used to travel there regularly, and I had a great love for the country. And there was a time, again, long ago, when I could even speak French. I've essentially lost it. But I remember I went there a couple of years back, and I went to a town called Figeac in the department of the Lot, the sort of place I used to love in France. And I was horrified at the extent to which France has been hollowed out. And, to throw a war economy on top of all of this, there will be a lot of people in France who will be saying, pourquoi et pour qui? For whom and for why? Why and for whom?
Toilet Sauce says, what is the goal of shelling civilians in Donetsk, goading Russia and the DPR LPR into launching a frontal attack on Avdiivka? They are avoiding that because it is the most fortified position anywhere in Donbass.
Yeah, that's the putative reason. But I think that at this point, it's just malicious.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is the rationalization. During the Mariupol siege, I saw a report. It was only one report, and I never saw it confirmed, that because of the missile attacks on Donetsk, some of the Donetsk militia that had been committed to the battle in Mariupol was insisted on going back and starting the attack on these very heavily defended, fortified lines, and that slowed the progress of the reduction of Mariupol. And it may be that there's some people in Kiev who are saying to each other, "This is why we're doing this," but fundamentally, it's not the real reason. The real reason they're doing this is because they're angry, because they're losing, and they're lashing out.
Yes, I completely agree. I also want to emphasize that it's understandable when you launch artillery strikes on an opposing force to goad them into attacking you. But to launch artillery strikes against civilians, the people that you claim to be trying to save, that has no excuse. I'm sorry, it has no excuse, no justification. No. It's just evil.
It's a war crime. This is a war crime. I mean,
this is a definition of it.
I mean, we've had lots of discussions about war crime, but indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas is a war crime. Period.
Brandon says, I am well trained. There is nothing you can do about it. You wanted a reset. Enjoy. Very much for that, Brandon. Alberto says, what weaknesses do Western strategists see in China that makes them believe confrontation will turn out successful?
I'll tell you straight away what they think. They think that China is short of raw materials, short of energy. They think they can impose a blockade, a naval blockade of China that will suffocate the Chinese economy because it won't get the raw materials it needs to function. And that in turn will trigger a political crisis in China, and that will lead to regime change. It's the thinking. The same thinking has happened with the Russians. You choke off the Russian economy from essential imports, you destabilize its financial system, and that will lead to a collapse of the Russian economy and regime change in Moscow. It's the same sort of kind of thinking, but of course it has a different perceptions. Now, China is not as dependent on its export trade as it once was, and it has taken steps to ensure itself with imports. And of course, the fact that it's working to build this arrangement with Russia is going to, ultimately provide it with that kind of economic security on the natural resources front that it needs.
I completely agree with everything that you've stated. They have this bizarre notion that the neocons have the notion that their power is limitless.
Yeah.
Just like a trust fund baby who thinks his trust fund has a limitless amount of money at its disposal.
XFX, welcome to the Drown community. Euro Gabor says Hungary and Serbia have signed a strategic cooperation regarding energy supply and infrastructure development. Is this new cooperation viable regarding what happened between Hungary and Poland?
Well, I think Hungary and Serbia have a lot more in common politically at this present moment, certainly over the Russian issues, than Hungary and Poland do. But of course, the problem is that Hungary and Serbia are small countries, and they're caught, if you like, in a battle of the giants. And the risk is that they might get trampled. Now, I was just reading, just before we looked at this, what Vucic was saying, and he talked. This is a speech, and he talks. These are his words. Our country is getting ready for a severe winter. We intend to provide all that is essential, but we get a dozen new problems each day. And in particular, we need to bear in mind that we will no longer be able to receive Russian oil from November. We need to make sure we have enough fuel oil, but the NIS oil company does not have enough fuel oil. We'll import 20,000 tons of fuel oil, but we need 120,000 tons for the whole winter. And he seems to be expecting we'll no longer be able to import Russian oil from November due to sanctions imposed against Russia, and who knows what other sanctions will be imposed by then. So he clearly doesn't think that this carve out for the pipeline is going to be enough.
No, and also, look, unfortunately, Serbia is very pro-Russian, as everybody knows. No. And Viktor Orban, I think that Viktor Orban is a very big man. He is certainly the biggest statesman in Europe. Because his country is small, he will never be a great world historical figure. He certainly has a talent for it. And had he been the president of the European Union, which of course is an impossibility, but had he been, things would have been so much better, not only insofar as this conflict is concerned, but also for the future of Europe. But, ruled by bureaucrats, Ursula von der Leyen is what you get. And so the issue is that I think that they will try, both in Serbia and Hungary, they will try to maintain their relations with Russia. But there is the obvious geographic distance. The fact that both of these countries are nestled in, yes, they are in Eastern Europe, but pretty much in the heart of the EU zone, the NATO zone. So they're kind of like stuck. And I don't think that there's going to be any kind of situation. The only thing I could think of is if the Russians were to have some sort of bridge directly to Hungary through the rump and emasculated Ukraine that will be left over. But I don't really see it. I don't know. I mean, we'll have to see how it plays out. But at this time, I think that their fortunes, both Serbia's and Hungary's, are going to be very poor.
Yeah. They're certainly going to run into difficulties. Carry on. Carry on, Alex. Yeah.
Matt Lass X says not even Jesse Owens got canceled at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Yet look at what the All England club is doing at Wimbledon.
Well, I as a British person, I am extremely angry about this. I also happen to believe that it's against the law. But it's happening now. I mean, Wimbledon, of course, has now been made. It's no longer one of. And I would say the tennis players around the world have, responded properly to this. So Wimbledon has lost its status. It's no longer going to be a place where tennis players get seeded. But so it's essentially become if you like, an
exhibition.
An exhibition, exactly. But all the same, that such a thing should have been done is absolutely outrageous, and I would once have thought it inconceivable.
Has Djokovic, is he going to play?
I don't know. I'm so angry that
Why wouldn't he?
I've
Why
stopped
wouldn't he?
following.
As a Serbian, maybe out of
Oh no, he'll
sympathy.
play. No, he'll play. He'll play. I think.
Okay.
I haven't seen any reason why he can't.
No, it's not that he can't, but that he won't. That out of solidarity with the other Belarusian.
He was in the French. He was in the French. He was in the.
Yeah,
French
but they didn't in the French Open. They didn't have these conditions, right? Of like basically like denounce your own government in order to compete. Well, we'll see about Djokovic, because when is it's in a couple of weeks, right?
Oh, it is indeed. It's very soon. But as I said, I completely swore. I used to follow tennis quite avidly. I mean, I was never a tennis player. I can't. My eyesight makes that impossible. But
me too.
This time, I'm having nothing to do with it.
No.
Arctic Knight says, "Hello. Do you think that Ukraine is intentionally sending older mobilized people who might have Soviet Russian sentiments to the Donbass to save the young nationalists? Greetings from Slovenia."
You know, I once thought, yes, I once thought that might be what they were doing, that they were actually building up, that they're holding back the young men to preserve and train them up and create this big Western, this army in the West, which would then be rearmed with Western weapons. I said this might be the strategy. It's not the case. They're just pulling everybody together and throwing them into the battle. And, the reason partly is because a lot of the young men are evading the draft. So, you go for the older ones. And a lot of these people also, it seems, are coming from Western Ukraine. So the older people, it's a misconception, because the Western Ukraine was never particularly Sovietized. They were never particularly, attracted to Soviet type politics. So it doesn't actually have that kind of rationale. By the way, Gonzalo did a pretty good video not very long ago, about the fact that there isn't going to be this great army marching from Western or Central Ukraine into battle in the East to win back all these lands. And I would suggest people, might want to watch that.
Thanks.
Brandon says, Posada woke me. Espadival says, why hasn't the DPR plus the RUF cleared places like Marianka, etc.? That's within shelling distance of Donetsk City. The line of contact hasn't moved since the beginning of this military operation.
Gonzalo and Toilet Source have already answered this. These are incredibly heavily. These are the most fortified areas of the front line. I mean, if you attack it head on, well, obviously, if you prepared to send 100,000 men to breaking through these lines, you probably would. But the scale of the operation means that they haven't done that. And I mean, what they're doing is they're coming from the flanks, and they'll basically encircle it, and that's what they'll do. Gonzalo, over to you.
No. Well, thanks very much for the endorsement of the video. And insofar as that, I don't know the specific reasons, but see, the people there on the ground, they probably have very good reasons for whatever they're doing. These people are very capable. I mean, I've said this before. The Italians are good at food. The French are good at fashion. The Russians, they're good at war. And so if whatever decisions that they're making insofar as this conflict is concerned, they probably have a very, very clear idea as to why they're doing it. And if they're not clearing out some city or other, it must be for a good reason. That's how I would view it at this time.
I would quickly add that's, I think, what the Ukrainians and the West thought they would do. And I think Toilet Source is absolutely right. It's the shelling of Donetsk is partly to goad the the Russians into doing those things. And of course, it's never good strategy to let the other side shape your actions.
Exactly.
Sanjeva says, God bless the Duran. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Sanjeva. Raphael says, I have said it before, foreign policy cannot be based on false superiority complex, bigotry, ignorance, and prejudice. West needs to apologize.
Yeah, absolutely true.
They never will.
They never will. Apology.
Matt Les X says, you did a video a few days ago about Syria, and you mentioned Turkey, the U.S., and Israel making moves there. But you all did not mention what role or interest Iran may have. Why is Syria so pivotal?
You're completely right. And I think that we do need to do a program on Iran,
Iran.
because lots is going on in Iran. Obviously, there's Iran in Syria, which is an important story, but there's also Iran in the Gulf, and there's the JCPOA. And everything is happening in Iran at accelerating speed. And of course, by the way, the other thing is that Iran is now making moves towards Russia. Russia's making moves towards Iran. They're linking up their financial systems, which might have important impact, by the way, on stabilizing the Iranian economy, which has been very unstable. If it's linked to a very stable financial system, which is much bigger, but there's lots to say. And I think, coming back to Syria, the Iranians are not going to be happy about Turkey intervening in this particular way. The Iranians do, however, have considerable influence over the Kurds, and it may be that they will try to persuade the Kurds to listen to what President Assad is saying to them, which is, work with us because Turkey is an existential danger to you, and we are not.
I also wanted to emphasize something else that is happening. I've been hearing a lot of commentary, and I haven't really focused on it, but I think that I'm going to, on the domestic situation in Israel. It seems that something's going on in Israeli society that it seems to be falling apart in a way. Many people have been commenting on this act. Oh, by the way, somebody has a cell phone near their thing. Because I can hear the cell phone buzzing, and it's not mine. I don't have a cell phone near me. Anyway, I just wanted to say that I think that the Israeli situation is something that we should pay attention to. That domestically, that Israel is not as hunky dory as it portrays itself to the Western media.
Okay. I've lost track of events in Israel, by the way, so I have to educate myself a bit more.
We'll have to get back on top of that pony.
Yeah.
Ola says, when will European capital flee Europe? Or when will? When will?
It's already happening.
It's already happening.
I can speak with some authority of that. It's moving away. Europeans are, because capital controls seem to be in the offing. They're already making. I just saw this morning some Twitter guy, some economist that I follow, was mentioning something that effectively the Americans are proposing this, and I have to look into it. I was going to look into it after this conversation, but it seems if there is a big implosion in the global economy, we're going to have de facto capital controls. They won't call them capital controls, but it'll be that. And so I think that a lot of money in the United States and in Europe is trying to position itself to exit or is already exiting, because if you have capital controls and a devaluing currency, well, basically that's a giant tax on your capital. So you want to get out of that market as soon as possible and get into something more stable. And what I know is that there are a lot of investors who are desperately trying to figure out a way to get a piece of the Russian action, because they see Russia and the ruble, and they're like, that's where I want to be. But there isn't an easy way to do it. It's actually remarkably difficult. Don't ask me how I know.
Fadista says, please discuss the Fed's QT and what this might achieve.
Gonzalo?
QE or QT?
QE. I imagine it's QT, QE.
Look, it's more of the same. Okay, it's just different day, same shit. I mean, it's just fueling this catastrophe. Because again, to the point that Alexander made earlier, it's this desire to never have a recession ever again. And so you create money and you inflate the economy until it basically pops eventually. And the thing is, see, when a balloon pops, it's just air. But you have to imagine this balloon, and forgive me for being so vulgar, but you two are the gentleman and I'm the vulgarian. When this bubble pops, it's just going to be all this shit that is going to cover everybody. Okay, that is the metaphor that you should be thinking of for the end of this bubble of QE and all the other inflationary measures that they've implemented.
Yeah, I mean, could it be that what is being referred to here is the taper? In other words, we're going to end QE or scale down QE at the same time as we're going to go for this interest rate increase, which the speculation in the market is going to be, 775 base points or something on that kind of scale. Well, all I will say about that is we will see an interest rate increase. And we will see a scaling down or an ending of QE, and that will make a difference. I mean, people will notice it, but it's not going to make anything like the amount of difference that's needed to bring inflation under control. As Gonzalo said,
I have to disagree.
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
I agree with you. They're going to bump up interest rates 75 basis points, no question. But I disagree that they are going to scale back QE in any significant way. They're going to call it something else. But I think that they're going to need a demand for treasuries because there isn't the depth of the market for treasury bonds.
Yeah.
At this time, do you know that the Federal Reserve is carrying over 40% of 10 to 30-year treasury bonds?
Well, this is the point, because it's the point I was going to make. You see, I don't think it's sustainable anyway.
No,
I think that they're going to try and do this and hope that this will somehow stop inflation. It's not going to be anything like enough, and then the problems in the financial markets and the real economy are going to be so enormous. And the political pressures from the Democrats are going to be so huge that I think they're going to reverse it. And we're going to start to be hearing in a few months' time, or a few weeks' time even, about how the Fed made this huge mistake, allegedly, in tightening monetary policy, even as supposedly, inflation was about to fall or something of that kind. Because whenever we really reach these kind of points, when it looks as if the Fed is preparing to do something that's going to bring this, this punch bowl, this thing to an end. The market reacts, the politicians react, and it goes into reverse because the Fed just won't see the thing through. And I'm afraid that's what's going to happen again this time. It's not going to be big enough. It's not going to be strong enough a tightening of monetary policy to make a difference. Yeah. And to the extent it has an effect and people notice it, they will reverse it very quickly.
Yes, your point. Yes, I completely agree with what you're saying. Absolutely. Yeah.
Beard Fly says, finally found you. YouTube was suppressing your channel. Thank you, Beard Flies, for that super chat. Sparky says, globalist leaders hollowed out their nations, leaving shells which can no longer survive on their past credibilities. Chickens are coming home to roost.
True. Absolutely correct.
Thank you very much for that. Sparky Toilet Sauce says, why is the Russian government afraid of a strong ruble? I understand that a weak ruble makes their products more competitive in the export market. But if you pride yourself on self-reliance, is a strong currency not better?
I've come around to your view, Toilet Sauce. I have to say, up to now, and I think this is true in the pre-24th of February world, I think a weak ruble actually was beneficial in some ways because it did mean that exports were better, and it did make it less attractive to import goods, and that did provide some degree of protection to the Russian economy. I think in the completely different world that we're in today, a strong ruble actually is a good thing. And there are two reasons for this. Firstly, I don't think there's a risk of a vast flood of imports. I think that we now have moved into a much more controlled trading system for Russia. So I think they're able to control any import penetration. And I think domestically, a strong ruble inspires confidence. It makes the population think our currency is strong, therefore our economy is strong, therefore our country is strong. And at a time like this, confidence is the single most important thing. And coming back to the point I was making earlier, the fundamental problem, the thing that's held Russia back far more than anything else over the last 30 years, ever since Putin became leader, 20 years, is a lack of confidence. This lack of self-confidence created by the failures of the late Soviet era and by the 1990s. has made Russians very doubtful about themselves. And if this crisis brings that confidence back, then that's a good thing. And if a strong ruble is the way to do it, well, one of the ways to do it, well, that's a good thing too.
Yeah, I very much agree. But I think that Nabulina, the central bank in Russia, wants to keep the ruble at more like a Goldilocks kind of zone. And I think that the Goldilocks zone for them is probably where it was pre-conflict. The yo-yoing and now this very strong ruble, it's all good and fine to restore self-confidence. It's understandable. It's also very advantageous that sanctions exist because there's no goods where this excedent can go to. See, had the West not cut off Russia, it's possible that all of these very strong rubles would have exited for the euro and off into Europe, into consumer goods from Europe, right? And so I understand your point. I think that Russia is lucky because of the sanctions. And I think that the central bank will still try to dial it down because they don't want such a strong ruble that they price themselves out of the Eastern markets and the South Asian markets. And so I think that that's their concern. They don't care about Europe anymore or the United States because due to sanctions, they are no longer relevant markets to Russian producers of whatever goods or services. But Asia and South Asia, they're on the table. And so that's why I think they're going to dial down the ruble to, I think that their target is probably 70 rubles to the dollar, assuming a dollar at a steady pace.
Yeah. They're very far from that point now. It's 57 to the ruble.
Yeah,
57 rubles to the dollar at the moment.
You must freak them out. It's not necessarily healthy long term.
Blossoming Rose of Sharon says, "Hey guys, just wanted to say hi from the U.S. and Pennsylvania. You guys were the only reasonable and most accurate, up to the date news channel that replaced RT channel for me once it was shut down here in the good old U.S."
Hey, can I? I have to go now, but I just want to finish off this very interesting conversation. It's been delightful with both of you, gentlemen, as always. I just want to ask you guys something and leave a question. Why is it that we three and others in this commentary segment, Andrei Martyanov, Larry Johnson, Scott Ritter, Moon of Alabama, Dreisen, why is it that there are so few people who were pointing out that the emperor had no clothes? Why do you think it was? Because we're a very small set, and we all came to more or less the same agreement because we were looking at the information. Why do you think that so few people were willing to speak the truth? And why so many have been pushing lies and now they're having to walk back all those lies? Do you guys have any thoughts on this?
Well, that's a huge topic, Gonzalo. It's an enormous one. I mean, there is information control. That's one thing to say. There's also, of course, massive amount of information. Most people don't take their information from the kind of sources that we do. I mean, what we do takes a lot of time. It's very hard work. I mean, you know that. I mean, we all know that. I mean, you have to spend hours pouring through, finding out which are the reliable sources, comparing sources, doing those. Most people don't have the time to do that sort of thing. Governments ought to be able to do it. After all, they've got intelligence agencies. They've got teams of analysts. They don't do it. And because they haven't been doing it, because they haven't been telling the truth, and because after all they are the power, they control the rewards, they control academia, they have huge influence through the various donors who own the newspapers and what's published in the media too. It's very difficult, but I don't think we are so few. Actually, I think there are actually many. But of course, that many finds few outlets for to speak out or to think things through.